body lay between benches, eyes half open, instruments blinking a steady green. A silent alarm pulsed through the hallway while the eyewash station dripped onto the floor. In an interrogation room later, a single line cuts through the noise. We were done. On this campus, science promised control. Inside this lab, power disguised itself as mentorship. A professor, a star student, a secret affair threaded through late nights and locked doors. We'll follow the evidence. CCTV pulses, access logs, a voice note saved twice, and a reagent bottle gone missing. One unread voicemail will matter. To understand why, we need to go back to the first anomaly. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was an after-hours freezer fluctuation, a half-degree dip logged at 2:14 a.m. In a lab calibrated to tolerances, small deviations speak loudly. The star student saw it first, scrolling through routine graphs before a seminar. A single spike, then normal. If you've worked in a high-performing lab, you know the rhythm. Machines hum, protocols repeat, anomalies resolve with a shrug. But this one was different because the access system said no one should have been there. Badge logs confirmed an entry. A swipe registered exactly at 2:14 a.m. The account tied to that swipe wasn't listed for graveyard access. In fact, it shouldn't have been active at all. The student didn't flag it out loud. They sent a quiet email to the professor with the subject line, "Freezer 3, check?" The kind of message designed to document concern without sounding accusatory. There was no reply that morning. Lab culture rewards self-sufficiency. You fix small problems. You don't escalate unless something is on fire. By afternoon, the students still hadn't heard back, so they took a second look. The freezer's gasket was clean, temperature stabilized, no frost bloom. But the unease remained. Meanwhile, the lab manager, who kept the place moving with color-coded tape and relentless checklists, stood over a spinning centrifuge, waiting for a balance to settle. Their coffee cooled on the bench. They'd run this drill 100 times, but something about the way the rotor vibrated felt off, subtle, almost like weight distribution had been guessed instead of measured. Routine shortcuts leave fingerprints you can feel. That evening, the professor finally responded, but not by email. A late-night message pinged the student. "Stop by my office after hours. Easier to discuss." The request sounded helpful. It was also unusual. After hours, one-on-one, no paper trail. The student went. That meeting would start a pattern. Questions handled privately, exceptions made quietly, and the first boundary moved without pushback. Stakes were invisible then. A freezer fluctuation can ruin months of work, but it also says something else. Someone crossed a line. In labs like this, the unwritten rule runs deep. Get results, ask forgiveness later. The professor framed the anomaly as a technical hiccup. Calibration noise, they said, happens when facilities run diagnostics. The student nodded because the hierarchy rewards agreement. The conversation slid toward project timelines, milestones, opportunity. The professor praised the student's advanced responsibility, then suggested more efficient access, a shared workaround just for them. What nobody knew at the time, that small yes would become the lever for everything that followed. The student left the office with two gifts. One was tangible, a rare technical text, the kind mentors offer when they want to signal sponsorship. The other was an informal permission. Use my spare key card if you're blocked. For efficiency, that single phrase rationalized a door held open and a log that wouldn't match. It also offered something the student craved, trust. When you're the star, praise feels like oxygen. You take more shifts, you accept more responsibility, and you avoid making noise. Back in the lab, the manager updated reagent logs to be finished later, as they often did when the day ran long. Safety drills had slipped the month before. Everyone promised to catch up after the conference. On the whiteboard, milestones crept closer. A grant deadline hovered. The students' peers watched a familiar pattern. favoritism that looked like opportunity if it wasn't yours. They didn't confront it. Nobody wanted to jeopardize their path. The culture absorbed the friction. 3 days after the freezer dip, access reports showed another after-hours entry. This time, the badge identifier looked like the professor's, but phone records placed them on a late-night call across campus. The security office flagged it as likely tailgating, someone catching a door before it latched. They wrote it up. No enforcement followed. You could feel the lab shift nocturnal. Lights clicked on at 1 a.m. Pipette boxes emptied by dawn. The students stayed later, arriving earlier, logged into instruments under shared sessions. And the professor's compliments came with contingency. "We'll need your help to keep this pace." Here's where the psychological ground moved. The student equated access with belonging. The professor equated compliance with loyalty. That calculus rewarded secrecy. Meanwhile, the anomaly kept nagging. The freezer shouldn't have dipped if no one was inside, and the swipe shouldn't have cleared the door. The student composed another email, this time drafting and deleting twice. What's the right tone when you suspect the rules are slipping? They didn't send it. Instead, they walked down the hall. In the lab, the centrifuge hummed again, perfectly balanced now. The manager had retaped a cracked tube rack. Small fixes keep disasters away. Until they don't. The student checked freezer 3 once more, lingering a beat longer than needed. It looked normal. It felt wrong. When a system trains you to ignore friction, intuition becomes your last line of defense. The student's next action was quiet, but decisive. They exported a copy of the access logs to a personal folder, not to accuse anyone, to keep a clean version, just in case. That, just in case, would become the backbone of the case. But for now, it was only a feeling, a half-degree dip, a ghost swipe, a professor's late-night meeting, and a lab that began to tolerate exceptions. Everything still looked like excellence on the outside. Inside, you could hear the first crack. From the outside, it started as merit. The professor called it advanced responsibility, the kind of phrase that opens doors without naming the price. The student was invited to office hours that ran long. Work bled into mentorship. Mentorship slid into access. You can chart the slope in emails that began crisp and technical, then warmed a few degrees at a time. The first shifts are always small. A well done became, only you could have pulled this off. Let's review the protocol became swing by after hours, quieter then. Praise, in the right context, is a governance tool. It tells you who you are here and who you'll be if you keep saying yes. In the profile, the professor favored selective warmth, bursts of attention, then distance. It conditioned pursuit. The student learned to earn proximity. Now, watch the language in their messages. Early notes read like journal entries stripped for parts, reagent orders, run durations, expected yields. Weeks later, the emails carried stray personal cues. Get some sleep, don't forget dinner. Proud of you. The content stayed about the work. The tone didn't. That's how boundary lines move. They aren't broken, they're redrawn. Then, the off-campus dinner. Framed as celebration for hitting a milestone, justified as networking with donors who value FaceTime. It wasn't on the lab calendar. It didn't need to be. The student arrived to find no donors, just the professor and a table set for 2. The conversation mixed science with biography, childhoods, sacrifices, the usual alchemy that turns shared grind into intimacy. The student left, believing they'd been chosen. Selection is intoxicating when the institution is a maze. Consider the gift, a rare technical text, out of print, marked with annotations in the margin. On the surface, it was a resource. In practice, it was a totem, a physical reminder that the professor saw a future only they could unlock. Gifts inside hierarchies create obligation. If you take it, you accept the story of how you'll get where you're going. Here's the key pivot. The professor offered a shared lab key card for efficiency. If blocked by night access windows or badge glitches, the student could keep experiments moving. Efficiency is the favorite word of corner cutters with reputations to protect. The student agreed. They weren't foolish. They were ambitious in a system that equates speed with worth. What nobody labels at that moment is consent. Consent to additional hours, consent to isolation, consent to be beholden. Peer distance followed. Group lunches became solo benchwork. Invitations to casual study groups dropped. Favoritism has a social cost. It brands you as protected and suspect at once. The student felt the chill and doubled down on excellence, because performance is the only answer that seems available when you can't complain without losing the mentor who writes your letters. The professor modulated scarcity. A week of access, then a day of cold shoulder. A late-night response, then silence during normal hours. It created a chase. The student adjusted sleep around those rhythms, showing up at the lab when the professor was likely to appear, texting just before midnight to ask about next steps. The replies came with emojis now, not many. Enough. What about power disclosure? There wasn't any formal one. No acknowledgement that a romantic relationship inside this mentorship would be coercive by design. That's the thing about unequal structures. The higher party can claim mutuality because the lower party nods. But the nod happens under gravity. Meanwhile, the research clock tightened. The grant demanded milestones. The professor told the student, "We're under scrutiny, but you thrive under pressure." It's a compliment wrapped around a request to say yes again. Office hours shifted to the professor's off-campus apartment to avoid interruptions. That line matters. It removed witnesses. It made the relationship invisible to colleagues who might have intervened. Isolation is both a tactic and a byproduct. Inside those rooms, the professor reinforced the story. The student was exceptional, indispensable, and uniquely understood. In the psychological profile, that's cold calculation masked as care. Not because the professor didn't feel affection, but because need and strategy aligned. The professor needed output and loyalty. The student needed belief and access. Those needs fit like interlocking gears until friction, ethics, audits, sleep deprivation, made heat. You can hear the shift in a voice note the student recorded weeks later, a private practice run for a conversation they were afraid to have. "I don't know where the boundary is anymore," they said. "I don't think I agreed to this." That's the cost of praise weaponized as permission. The student wasn't naive. They were cornered by gratitude. Back in the lab, the shared keycard solved little problems quietly. An instrument lockout here, a late reagent dropped there. Each exception normalized the next. The professor framed it as trust. The student absorbed it as debt. And peers looked away because calling it out meant challenging the person grading their progress and funding their stipends. Silence is a system's best ally when outcomes look good. Then came the first clear breach. And offhand, we, in an email from the professor that had nothing to do with experiments. "We should take a night off." It's one word, but it's a declaration. The student replied with a neutral line about lab schedules, trying to keep the language professional. But language was no longer the point. Access was. The affair wasn't announced. It unfolded as a series of conveniences, a ride after a late run, a hand on a shoulder held a beat too long, a kiss dismissed later as a moment. From there, the private mentorship became private life. The power imbalance didn't disappear because both parties felt something. It shaped every choice after. The student's world reorganized around the professor's approval. The professor's identity fused tighter with the lab's success and the image of benevolent genius. That fusion made secrecy feel necessary. It also made the stakes intolerable if exposed. So when the first audit email landed and the freezer dip still gnawed at the student, The affair's origin wasn't romance. It was logistics turned leverage. Praise opened the door. Privacy locked it, and consent stretched across a hierarchy, frayed. While the private mentorship tightened, the lab kept shining. Papers moved from draft to acceptance with satisfying regularity. Conference posters drew crowds. The group photo on the department website looked like success. Inside that picture, the real governance came from unwritten rules. Get results? Ask forgiveness later. It wasn't printed anywhere. You heard it in how people praised speed and teased caution. A precautionary pause could cost you authorship. A bold shortcut, if it worked, made you a problem solver. The professor never needed to say it outright. The incentives spoke fluently. Graduate students noticed the imbalance. The star student got the best instrument time, the prime reagents, the quiet nods that meant priority. They also took the overnight shifts, the scramble fixes when a run went off script. That's the exchange. Favoritism buys you pressure along with perks. Peers kept their distance. They swapped glances when the whiteboard magically updated after midnight. They didn't confront the pattern, because whistleblowing in a tight field is career roulette. Safety drills slipped. The lab manager knew the checklists by heart, but deadlines pushed the calendar and the drill to next month. Reagent logs were drafted with pencil, waiting for a calm hour to formalize in the database. Calm hours never arrived. When the week ended with a high-yield pilot, nobody wanted to slow down for signatures. They promised to backfill the details. Paperwork always catches up, until it doesn't. Supervisors signed exception forms post hoc. An unregistered pilot run got folded into a calibration entry. A solvent disposed without full notation earned a shrug. The professor framed these adjustments as tactical, not reckless. We know the system, they'd say. We also know the science. That line separated insiders who trusted themselves from outsiders who trusted rules. Meanwhile, a new campus grant landed with strings, milestones tied to disbursements. The clock started. 6 weeks to produce data robust enough to impress donors and reviewers. The professor took meetings and made promises. The student became the execution arm of those promises because they could move at 2 a.m. without waiting for building services or day shift approvals. Efficiency, again, as a virtue and a shield. Here's where quiet compromises multiply. A control run skipped because prior data already established the baseline. A reagent substitution justified by chemical equivalence, though the label said otherwise. Pipette tips from an unlogged box when the main stock ran out. None of these acts alone reads like sabotage. Together, they reshape risk. The lab's social map adapted. People learned which benches to avoid after hours, which fridges to check twice, which questions to leave unasked if they wanted to keep their projects funded. The manager, who saw the whole chessboard, started arriving earlier to audit with their eyes. Tape alignment, tip box counts, balances slightly miszeroed. They corrected small misalignments because small misalignments are how big failures enter the room. The professor's charisma covered gaps. In meetings, they described protocols with precision, glossing over where reality diverged by fractions. If a reviewer pressed for raw data, the lab delivered polished outputs with matching slopes. Under pressure, slope matching becomes a habit. Once you make a figure pretty, you're tempted to believe the pretty version is the truest one. Compliance existed, but as a distant weather system. Emails arrived in campus tone, neutral, procedural, CC'd to too many. People skimmed them, filed them, and returned to the bench. When the audit ping later flagged after-hours anomalies, it felt like noise until it wasn't. Even then, the first reaction wasn't alarm. It was, how do we make this administratively tidy? Here's the psychology. The star student had internalized that belonging requires solving problems quietly. They adjusted logs to match daytime patterns when an instrument auto-saved a timestamp from 1:47 a.m. They told themselves it was harmless, aligning reality with schedule, avoiding the hassle of requesting retroactive approval. Every quiet edit moved the boundary again. The professor curated this culture. Not through orders, through stories. They told origin myths about their own scrappy early days, sleeping by incubators, making calls to facilities from payphones, sneaking into closed rooms to rescue experiments from maintenance outages. The message was simple. The system is clumsy, but the dedicated find a way. That narrative makes rule-bending feel like integrity. What nobody addressed directly was the cost. One international teammate sat at a visa renewal threshold tied to continuous enrollment and good standing. A misconduct finding could collapse everything for them in an afternoon. Another was supporting family with a stipend that depended on the grant staying live. These stakes turned collective caution into collective silence. If you spoke up, you didn't just risk your future, you risked theirs. Meanwhile, the lab manager sent gentle reminders. Please finalize reagent logs today. Safety refresher next week. And got thumbs-up emojis in return. Emojis are a proxy for agreement when people are exhausted. Agreement is not compliance. The checklists kept slipping. A small micro-story captures it. One Tuesday at dawn, the manager reset a tape boundary around the chemical waste cabinet. By evening, the tape was stretched, the corner lifted, a glove print smudged the edge. Someone had cut a minute off a disposal trip. A minute saved becomes a minute expected. The thing is, expectations calcify faster than rules. The result was a lab that performed at a high level while tolerating exceptions as proof of commitment. The professor's selective warmth kept loyalty high. The students' deepening dependence kept the nocturnal workflow running. The rest of the team learned to orbit around both. Nothing exploded, nothing burned, but the conditions for a crisis were set. Corner cutting normalized, oversight delayed, and one person with both motive and means moving freely in the dark. The money arrived with a stopwatch attached, milestones, deliverables, interim data, each one fixed to a date that wasn't negotiable. The professor sold it as validation. They believe in us. What they meant was, hit the targets or the stream closes. On paper, 6 weeks looked generous. In practice, the protocols required cycles that didn't care about calendars. Biology runs on its own time. The professor had made private promises to donors, not just outputs, impact. The lab's work would be presented to a board in a room where metrics become reputation. That board didn't read raw data. It read stories built from data. The student became the arm that turned possibility into slides. Nights stretched because every day ate itself too quickly. Exhaustion alters ethics. When you're tired, you make pragmatic choices and call them minor. Controls trimmed from 3 to 2 for efficiency. A verification step nudged to tomorrow because the signal looked clean enough. In that mood, small deviations stop feeling like deviations. They feel like momentum. The professor's emails shifted to imperative. Need early readouts by Monday. Calibrate and push. Don't wait for facilities. The student complied because the alternative was letting the mentor down, and letting the mentor down meant risking everything attached to that mentor's name. Meanwhile, the grant's reporting portal pinged reminders. Progress updates had to align with stated methods. The professor understood the dance. Keep the narrative within the boundaries while nudging the practice at the edges. To sell that, they needed pace. Pace depended on access. Access after hours depended on the shared key and the culture that no longer asked questions about who was in the lab at 2 a.m. Unregistered pilot runs slid into the gaps. The rationale sounded clinical. Calibration. If you run an unlogged test, you can adjust variables without cluttering the official record. If it fails, it never happened. If it looks promising, you fold it into the next documented run and call it iteration. That's how temptation grows. Each successful shortcut lowers the perceived cost of the next. Results started to look good. Not groundbreaking, but trending in the direction that makes donors lean forward. The student, who was doing real, careful work under pressure, felt the hit of pride when a curve matched expectation. That pride coexisted with a knot of dread. They knew what verification they'd postponed. They could feel the gap between what they'd done and what the portal would claim they'd done by what date. Dissonance like that doesn't vanish. It gets stored. The professor's private calendar filled with donor dinners and department briefings. The student's calendar filled with silent blocks labeled run, analyze, prep. In their messages, the professor promised protection. If anyone questions our timeline, I'll handle it. Protection is attractive until you realize it only works as long as you keep feeding the machine. If you slow down, the protection withdraws. Now consider the stakes across the team. An international colleague depended on the grant staying compliant for their visa status. Another needed the stipend's continuity to support family. The student internalized not just their own risk, but everyone else's. That's a heavy lever for compliance. It keeps you quiet when you'd otherwise push back on a method that feels too fast. When the first interim report loomed, the lab scrambled to align narrative and trace. Logs needed to reflect daytime activity. Instrument timestamps had to match reported windows. The student learned the soft skills of making reality look administratively tidy. Shifting session headers, renaming folders, moving files into sequences that suggested a cleaner arc. None of this made the data false. It made the story comfortable. The professor, sensing the wobble underneath, turned more controlling. They centralized data on a lab server with restricted permissions to protect IP. They collected lab notebooks at week's end for synthesis. They offered selective warmth when the student delivered and frost when the student questioned. That toggling is a classic control pattern. It narrows the path: perform and be seen, hesitate and disappear. A campus grant liaison sent a friendly check-in. All on track? Any support needed? The professor replied with glossy language about momentum and resilience. The student saw the email in the CC list and felt the split screen, what the lab told the world and what the bench felt like at 3 a.m., with the hum of a PCR and the ache in your wrists. That ache becomes proof you're necessary, which makes you double down again. By week 4, the lab had a stack of figures ready for the boardroom. They looked clean. They were not fully verified. The professor scheduled a rehearsal and coached cadence, emphasized the breakthrough, minimized the caveats, promised replication underway. The students stood at the back, hearing their own nights distilled into bullet points, pride and unease braided again. This is the moment the audit email landed in inboxes. A small, bureaucratic subject line. Unusual access after midnight detected. Please clarify. You can feel the room's temperature drop. The professor drafted a response, deleted, drafted again. The grant clock didn't stop. The portal still expected uploads. The donors still expected a story. Under the stopwatch, the lab's quiet compromises hardened into a plan. Adjust the logs, smooth the edges, keep the pace. What nobody realized yet was how that single email would turn exhaustion into panic, and panic into evidence. The subject line looked routine. Inquiry, after-hours access irregularities. It hit inboxes at 9:12 a.m., right between a reagent delivery confirmation and a calendar ping. Compliance wanted clarification on several entries between 1:45 and 2:30 a.m. over the last month. They attached a CSV, dates, times, door IDs. The pattern was undeniable. Someone was in the lab when the system said they shouldn't be. Stakes snapped into focus. An access violation wasn't just a wrist slap. It linked to safety breaches, protocol questions, and the grant's integrity. For the international teammate, a misconduct finding could jeopardize visa renewal. For the lab, it risked a funding freeze. For the professor, it threatened reputation, years of image building compressed into a few lines of metadata. The professor opened a reply window, typed, deleted. Typed again. The first draft leaned on facilities. Maintenance testing sometimes triggers phantom swipes, but the CSV listed successful entries and motion detections. The second draft emphasized calibration runs and the need for continuous monitoring to safeguard sensitive samples. It sounded reasonable, but it didn't match badge permissions. They closed the window. The thing is, explanations that almost fit don't survive auditors who read logs for a living. Moving from the scene to the suspect's profile, the professor called the student in with a brisk text. "Need to sync today. Bring access notes." The student arrived to find the door closed, blinds tilted, the room cooler than usual. The professor's tone was even. "Compliance is asking questions. We need to make the records reflect when the real work happened." That line, "make the records reflect," did a lot of work. It framed edits as accuracy rather than retrofitting. The student froze. They knew which entries pointed to them, which pointed to the shared key. They knew about the tailgating note buried in security's write-up. If they adjusted logs now, they'd be deepening a lie that could fracture across the entire team. If they refused, they'd be alone against a mentor who controlled letters, recommendations, access. Consider the quiet panic. The student stepped into a side room and recorded a voice note. Not a confession, a record of state. "They want me to adjust the logs to show daytime runs. I did run at night, but with permission. I'm saving originals. If something happens, check my external." The voice trembled, then steadied. "This isn't okay." They didn't send it to anyone. They saved it, then exported a clean copy of the access logs to a personal drive and encrypted a duplicate in cloud storage. The mind as a locked box, 2 keys, hidden in different places. Now, let's look at the mechanics of the request. The professor proposed shifting instrument session headers so that auto-saved files appeared under daytime folders. They suggested annotating the reagent ledger to align with standard hours, retro-justifying a calibration narrative. They framed it as protection for the lab. "Auditors don't understand the pace we keep. We'll get dragged for nothing." When the student hesitated, the professor pressed the team stakes: visas, stipends, deadlines. Pressure reframed as solidarity. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Campus politics has sharpened their knives. A rival faculty member had already asked for raw data for collaboration 2 days earlier. The timing wasn't random. Whispers about favoritism and late-night lights fed a rumor mill that moved faster than policy. The audit email gave those whispers teeth. If the rival tipped compliance, the audit wouldn't end at swipe logs. It would crawl through figures, timestamps, draft folders. The professor knew that. Their drafts and deletes weren't indecision. They were strategy failing to find cover. What nobody knew at the time, the student's backup would become the definitive timeline. In the moment, it was a hedge against being rewritten out of their own work. They copied instrument caches, pulled server sync histories, and zipped them with timestamps intact. Then, they wrote a neutral email to the professor. "I can review logs to ensure clarity. For accuracy, we should note actual run windows and rationale." The phrasing mattered. Accuracy, rationale. It edged toward honesty without detonating the room. The professor replied within minutes, avoiding text. "Stop by. Easier to align in person." In that meeting, the professor softened. They talked about scrutiny, about how donors misread bumps as failures, about how every lab learns to translate chaos into clean narratives. "I'll take the heat. If anything goes wrong," they said. "But help me get this across the line." The student nodded, but their eyes had moved past the desk toward the drawer with the extra key card they weren't supposed to know existed. In the aftermath of the meeting, the student opened the auditor's CSV again. One entry glowed, 2:14 a.m., the same minute as the freezer dip weeks earlier. The badge ID tied nominally to the professor, but the call records placed them elsewhere on campus. If the professor's card was used there, someone either had that card or got through on a door hold. Intent or complicity. Either path raised the stakes. By evening, a draft response to compliance went out from the professor's account. Our lab maintains environmental stability for sensitive work. During maintenance cycles, we conduct calibration that may extend beyond posted hours. We can provide a rationale for specific entries. It was a placeholder, a delay. It bought 48 hours. The student used those hours to save one more thing, a second, private backup of the original logs, labeled with an innocuous file name and hidden behind a folder tree of unrelated coursework. That duplication would matter. It preserved the audit's before picture untouched by clarity. Across campus, the rival prepared their own move, and down the hall, the lab manager locked up, unaware that a missing reagent vial would soon make the audit email look quaint. While compliance waited for a clean explanation, another pressure point formed across the hall. A rival faculty member, long irritated by the professor's spotlight and donor access, sent a cheerful note. "Let's collaborate. Could you share raw traces from the last 2 posters?" Collaboration is the polite mask for scrutiny. They weren't asking to help. They were asking to see the seams. The professor stalled with pleasantries. Still, the rival didn't pause. Their graduate assistant, sharp-eyed and underused, began combing the public poster files already online. High-resolution PDFs hold more than you think: axis ticks, noise patterns, faint compression artifacts. The assistant overlaid 2 figures from different months and noticed something that shouldn't repeat did: a duplicated noise fingerprint in the baseline. Real signal drifts. Copying imperfection is the tell. The assistant flagged it to their PI. The rival didn't go to the professor. They went to compliance and attached a memo. Possible figure duplication with screenshots and alignment marks. They added a second concern: after-hours access lights spotted during their own late sessions. The Whisper network had content now. Hints of favoritism hardened into the allegation that the lab was massaging timelines and data. The stakes jumped. If duplication held, the lab's credibility was on the line along with the professor's. A misconduct inquiry could freeze the grant, trigger internal review, and pull visa rugs from under international trainees. The rival understood the collateral but framed the tip as duty. Safeguarding standards protects everyone in the long run. That's how academic knives are sharpened, ethics as both principle and tactic. Unknown to them, across town, the professor was tightening their circle. They centralized access to raw files, insisted that all requests route through them, and told the student, "Don't share anything without my sign-off." It sounded like protection. It functioned like control. Meanwhile, the student had already saved unaltered logs to an external drive. 2 truths moved in parallel, one curated for the department, one preserved for the future. This was the moment everything changed for the social terrain. The rival's whisper reached grad lounges and copy rooms. People who'd ignored the late-night lights now traded specifics: the shared key rumor, the closed blinds, the off-campus dinners disguised as networking. Suspicion isn't evidence, but it primes interpretation. When the audit email surfaced in private chats, it fused with the rumor into a story. The professor was cutting corners, maybe more. The rival pressed their advantage. They offered the department chair a friendly solution: a collaboration meeting under the guise of cross-lab synergy. Get everyone in a room, ask polite questions, watch for cracks. The chair, mindful of donors and image, agreed to a soft touch. They invited the professor to present progress at a brown bag and share best practices. It was a stage built for exposure without saying the word. Speaking of motive, the rival had their own. Years of second-place finishes, grants lost by a whisper, students poached by charisma, breed an appetite for correction. They didn't need to fabricate anything, they just needed to hold a mirror. If the reflection showed strain, the room would do the rest. On the day of the brown bag, you could feel the temperature. The professor walked in with practiced ease, slides trimmed to the good parts. The rival sat near the front, the assistant 2 seats over with a notepad. When the duplicated noise slide appeared, tucked into a background figure, visible if you'd looked closely before, the rival's eyebrow lifted. During Q&A, the question landed soft. Can you speak to raw trace variability between runs? I noticed similarities that suggest strong control, commendable, but unusual. Commendable, then unusual. Compliment first, then the blade. The professor smiled. We've achieved instrument stability through rigorous calibration. It was polished. It didn't address the identical noise. The room murmured. The student watched from the back and felt a knot. They knew where the figures came from, knew how verification had slipped, knew which folders held the messy versions. They also knew the professor was building a rhetorical shield around a fragile core. Now let's pivot to compliance. The tip about duplication, combined with the access irregularities, escalated the audit from clarification to assessment. That meant pulling server logs, interviewing staff, examining draft files with metadata intact. The professor sensed the shift and grew irritable, curt with questions, tighter on message. Control slid toward coercion. In private, they told the student, "We can't let politics derail this. They're jealous. Stay focused." But there was one problem. The rival's assistant wasn't hunting drama. They were checking methods. They noticed timestamp clusters that didn't match instrument run lengths. They looked at cafe receipts posted on social media during supposed lab runs. The pattern didn't prove fraud. It proved strain between narrative and reality. Strain invites investigation. The lab mates felt the pressure. Loyalty split along lines of dependence and distance. Those closest to the professor defended the pace and the calibration claims. Those on the margins began hedging, softening endorsements, emphasizing their own separate projects. Fear made small inconsistencies bloom in interviews. A run probably done in the afternoon, a reagent likely logged on Wednesday. Likely is how truth erodes when stakes climb. In the aftermath of the brown bag, the rival filed a formal data access request under department policy. The chair couldn't refuse without looking complicit. The professor stalled again, citing IP. The stalemate told compliance what they needed to know: push harder. And while that push gathered, CCTV and access control prepared to become the silent witness to what happened at 2 a.m. when politics sleep but patterns don't. The building's eyes didn't blink. The corridor camera outside the lab captured a rhythm you could set your watch to. Lights popping on at 1:56 a.m., a figure's shadow sliding across frosted glass at 1:58, a door's latch releasing at 2 the south. No audio, just images and timestamps. Security pulled 6 weeks of footage and lined it against badge logs. Patterns emerged that people had ignored. Start with the obvious: repeated 2 a.m. entries on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Badge logs marked successful door events tied to the professor's credential on 3 of those nights. Yet, phone metadata showed the professor on extended calls from another building, even connected to a conference bridge abroad. Either the card was shared or the door was defeated by tailgating, someone catching it before it closed and timing it against motion sensors to look legitimate. Security had noted tailgating once before and wrote it up, then let it sit. In the reconstruction, those memos read like missed chances. The camera angle, fixed and uncompromising, showed pairs entering seconds apart. First a hoodie, then a coat sleeve that lingered near the jamb to keep the latch from settling. It wasn't dramatic. It was practiced. You could tell by the economy of movement. No fumbling, no hesitation. What nobody knew at the time, the access system stamped not only swipes, but door states. Open, closed, held, ajar. On the nights in question, Open, aligned with the professor's card, but held followed by ajar, told a richer story. Someone kept that door from relocking long enough for a second entry without a second swipe. If access is forged, intent rises. If access is shared, complicity rises. Either way, the lab's midnight routine wasn't accidental. Moving from the scene to the suspect's profile, investigators mapped the student's presence. Their own badge showed sporadic after-hours use before the grant, then a spike. But the key entries tied to the freezer fluctuation and later anomalies didn't register under their name. That narrowed possibilities: cloned credential, borrowed card, or entry through a door that didn't demand credentials at all. Security's report flagged another feed: stairwell CCTV. Twice, the same figure carried a tote that matched the lab's reagent carriers, the kind used to move sensitive items discreetly when you don't want to leave them unattended. The tote wasn't illegal. The timing was. The stairwell camera caught the tote descending at 2:05, then returning empty at 2:21. Meanwhile, instrument log showed a run initiated at 2:17, with the user field blank due to a shared session still active from earlier in the day. Shared sessions are the Achilles heel of audit trails. They blur authorship by design. Now, let's look at the mechanics of the access control. The system allowed temporary overrides during maintenance windows. Facilities scheduled firmware updates on the first and third Thursdays at 2:00 a.m. The corridor camera time-stamped a brief reboot blink at 2:04, one frame of darkness, then back. During that blink, the door controller cached its state and restarted. If held open, it would remain unlocked for 90 seconds until it re-handshook with the server. 90 seconds is enough to move a tote, place a mug, or swap a pipette rack. Someone knew the cadence. Investigators overlaid the maintenance calendar with the entry pattern. The alignment was too clean to be coincidence. Entries clustered within 3 minutes of controller reboots. To understand how, they checked who had access to those schedules: facilities, IT, and faculty with equipment downtime needs, like the professor. The student, by role, did not. That didn't prove who entered. It proved who could plan the window. Meanwhile, something else was happening that the cameras caught without context. On 3 nights, a second figure appeared 10 minutes after the first, standing at the corridor end, hands in pockets, waiting. They never approached the lab door. They turned away when lights flicked off inside, then left. Security tagged them as unknown observer. That detail mattered because observers are either lookouts or bystanders tracking a story. Interviews later tied one instance to the rival's assistant leaving late from another floor. The other 2 remained unclaimed. This was the moment everything changed for internal certainty. The professor argued that the pattern proved the lab's dedication, not deceit. "We calibrate when facilities least disrupt experiments," they said. But the badge inconsistency undercut that line. Investigators asked for the professor's card. It showed micro-scratches consistent with frequent use. The student's card did too. A third card, labeled as deactivated months earlier, still pinged once in door sensor noise, what security called a shadow swipe. That shouldn't happen. When tested, the controller accepted a deactivated UID for half a second before rejecting it, enough to populate logs with a phantom attempt if paired with a held door. Someone had played with boundaries, learning the system's edges. In the aftermath, security implemented immediate revocation audits and warned the department. Too late for this case, just in time for the next. For now, the footage told a simple, chilling narrative. A shadow routine took root at night, exploiting maintenance cycles and shared sessions, reinforcing the illusion of daytime order. The lab didn't just turn nocturnal. It adapted to surveillance and learned to slide between its frames. Which brings us to the night before the body was found. The night a voicemail went unheard and a high-tox reagent left the fridge without a line in the ledger. The cameras kept rolling, the door recorded its states, and the window everyone thought they could manage was about to be used for something you can't mislabel as calibration. 3 things happened the night before, and each one pulled the timeline tighter. At 6:12 p.m., the student called and left a voicemail. At 8:03, the professor set their phone to silent and walked into a donor dinner. And sometime after midnight, a high-tox reagent vial left the lab fridge without a matching entry. Start with the voicemail. The words were careful, the tone steady like someone reading a script they'd rehearsed alone. "We need to stop, or I go to compliance." No threats, a boundary. It referenced both the relationship and the logs, 2 strands twisted into the same rope. They asked for a meeting the next day, in daylight, with records present. It was a line in sand, but the professor didn't hear it. They were already at the dinner, phone face down under linen, replying by glance and nod to donors who wanted momentum and stories. The table setting mattered later. Fine napkins that shed microfibers, a catered menu, a coffee service with a bitter roast that left oils on cups. The professor held those cups between fingers that would later brush a mug in the lab. That's not a flourish. It becomes trace. Meanwhile, the lab's fridge inventory ticked forward. The manager had reconciled stocks at 5:40 p.m., a neat grid in the ledger. By 1:10 a.m., when the student prepped for an early run, a vial from the high-tox handle with barrier row was missing. No notation, no initials. The ledger gap wasn't proof of malice. Gaps happened. But this gap aligned with a night when access control would blink at 2 a.m., and the lab would light up on camera minutes later. The confluence concentrates suspicion. The students spent the evening preparing clean copies of logs. They exported backups, checked hashes, and organized a packet labeled Originals. Their plan was simple: daylight conversation, clear terms, and if that failed, a compliance appointment. The voicemail wasn't a bluff. It was notice. Across town, the professor's smile hardened by the hour. A pledge here, a photo there. The choreography of prestige. Between courses, they checked headlines about the field and ignored the rising stack of notifications. When they stepped out at 9:47 for air, one message peeked on the lock screen: the student's missed call timestamp. They didn't press play. Silence is a choice that buys time. Now, let's look at the practicalities. If you wanted to control a story, you'd control access. The professor had a spare key hidden where only someone who curated the space would look. The side door's maintenance window was known to them. They also understood how shared sessions on instruments could mask authorship. Knowledge doesn't equal action, but it lowers the friction to act. At 12:38 a.m., the student's device pinged near the lab. Not unusual for them, they weren't hiding. They planned to run a short prep and leave the confrontation for daylight. They set a mug by their bench, the same mug they always used, ceramic, chipped near the handle, washed and left upside down to dry. A familiarity that would later anchor a forensic pathway. What nobody knew at the time: another device activated on campus near the building's south face. A third phone, not registered to either of them, woke up, checked for a signal, and went quiet. That detail would matter weeks later. Tonight, it was just a blip in the tower log. At 1:57 a.m., the camera caught hallway lights flicking. The door state soon read, "Open, then held." 90 seconds of vulnerability. A tote moved inside. A hand, gloved, set something on a bench and left no dramatic print, only a smear where oils from prior handling met glove polymer residue. On the student's workstation, the mug that started the evening clean would be found later with a faint ring of coffee oils under the lip. Consider the psychology. The student had drawn a boundary. The professor, if they'd heard it, faced annihilation by exposure, personal and professional. That's the motive profile, not passion, control. Preserve the image, preserve the lab, preserve the self built on both. In that state, you rationalize preemptive moves as protection. Meanwhile, the reagent vial's absence wasn't random. The inventory tag matched a wee class of fast-acting inhalation hazards and contact toxins used in microscale protocols. If you were careless, you'd spill and activate the eyewash station. If you were deliberate, you choose delivery that looked like routine. A tainted surface, a mug, a pipette tip, preloaded with a residue that transfers on touch. Eyewash activation later would suggest sudden exposure, not ingestion. Tonight, it was just a missing line in a ledger. The voicemail still sat unheard at 2:06 a.m. The professor arrived back to their office by 11:28, according to a building entry log. They answered 2 emails, drafted a note to compliance they didn't send, then left again. No camera shows them at the lab, no badge pins them to the door. But access windows don't require swipes if you hold the door and time the reboot. That's the dilemma. Absence of a trace isn't proof of absence. By 2:14 a.m., the lab hummed, a protocol mid-cycle. The student documented setup steps the way they always did, economy of language, check marks aligned. They sent a text at 2:19, "We should talk at 10." It didn't deliver. The professor's phone was still on silent, tossed into a bag with a cloth napkin, tucked as a keepsake from the event. A small, pretentious habit that would leave fibers on places it shouldn't. What nobody saw was the hand that positioned the mug within reach. The corridor mic caught a faint clink at 2:03, like ceramic-kissed metal. Then nothing. Then work. Then the drip that would echo the next morning from the eyewash basin. The night closed with tasks half done, and a conversation deferred. The voicemail waited. The vial didn't return. And the clock rolled toward the moment when routine turned lethal. The discovery started like any other early shift. A research tech with a habit of beating sunrise swiped into the corridor and felt the prickle that comes when a lab sounds wrong. Machines running without voices nearby. The door sensor registered their entry, and the silent alarm tripped because the system read a mismatch. Room active, no expected user on schedule. Inside, instruments blinked steady green. A protocol mid-cycle. The eyewash station dripped onto the floor, pooling under the grate in a thin, clean fan. They saw the body between benches, collapsed at an angle that told a sudden fall, not a deliberate rest. Eyes half open, skin pale under the room's cold LEDs. The tech didn't touch them. They scanned for movement, for breath, then stepped back and hit the wall plate to stop the instruments. That reflex saved data windows and preserved a scene. It also froze time in the records, exact minute, exact interruption. Security arrived with campus responders. No sign of forced entry, no shattered glass. A stool tipped, a mug near the workstation with a faint ring under its lip. The eyewash handle hung down, recently pulled, its catch squeaking in a slow return. Eyewash activation matters. It's a handprint of panic. You don't pull it unless something hits you fast. Vapors, splash, a skin burn that shocks the nerves into action. The hallway filled with the mixed quiet of people trying to coordinate without contaminating evidence. The lab manager, summoned by a call that said only, "Come now," stood just short of the threshold, hands gripping a key ring they didn't realize they were holding. The professor arrived minutes later, breathless, voice pitched low and controlled. They asked what happened, eyes scanning benches, inventory, the student's station. In the profile, that scan wasn't grief. It was assessment. Responders noted a chemical odor, sharp, not solvent sweet, the kind that arrives as a thin line in the nose and then is gone. They set up fans at low to avoid aerosol spread, took air samples, and moved with deliberate slowness to preserve trace. They bagged the gloves left by the sink and a discarded swab in the trash. Small items matter when motive hides in delivery mechanisms. Now, the stakes went campus-wide. A body inside a lab is a safety crisis first, then a criminal one. The department chair was on the phone to environmental health before the stretcher left the room. The institution moved into lockdown. Floor closed, adjacent labs sealed, air handlers switched to isolation mode. Students waiting for morning slots watched from behind glass as responders in Tyvek filed past with cases and labels. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the background systems. The silent alarm's trigger pulled access logs and CCTV frames into a preservation bucket, sealing them against routine overwrite. That automatic move meant the timeline from 1:50 to 3 a.m. survived intact. Door states, motion detections, instrument session changes, and the corridor mic's faint clink recorded hours earlier. The preservation bucket would become the scaffold for everything that followed. Investigators walked the room the way you read a story from the middle. Pipette racks sat aligned. A protocol sheet on the bench had check marks through prep steps, then a blank where the next box should be. The student's notebook lay open, the date written, details tight, arrows neat. That neatness is a signature. When the line breaks, you know the moment something intervened. No liquid spill glowed under UV, no obvious splash on sleeves. But the eyewash drainage flowed clear and recent. The mug near the workstation didn't belong to the common set. It was personal, ceramic, chipped near the handle. It had a faint, glossy sheen where the lip met the interior curve, like oils that never quite wash away. The professor glanced at it, then away. In interviews, they'd call the death a tragic accident and point to poor culture around labeling. They'd do it within minutes before the first field test came back. From their perspective, the tech did what procedures demand. They backed out, logged time, waited for clearance to assist. The first responders checked vitals, called time after worked attempts to revive. Time of death window tightened around the last logged instrument step and the silent alarm. The lab manager answered questions in clipped phrases: who had access, what ran overnight, whether any vials were missing. That last question landed like a weight. The ledger would show a gap. The fridge would show an empty slot. Rumors moved faster than official emails. Across the building, text threads lit. Someone collapsed, maybe a spill, maybe worse. The rival heard before noon and asked, too brightly, whether the department needed help with communications. The chair said no and drafted a campus-wide note that said nothing specific. An incident, safety confirmed, classes continue. In the absence of facts, narratives breed. Investigators focused on immediate traces. They swabbed the mug's rim and handle, lifted a partial glove print from the bench that matched no known lab-issued glove texture, and collected pipette tips from the student's rack. They sealed the eyewash handle and grate for later analysis. They photographed fluorescence reflected in the pool on the floor, a minor detail that fixes angle and area for later reconstruction. Then came the first interviews. Short, raw, inconsistent. The professor used passive constructions. Protocols were followed. It appears there was exposure, and kept their distance from specifics. The students' peers split between fear and loyalty. Some mentioned late lights and shared sessions. Others insisted the lab followed rules. Small inconsistencies surfaced, the kind that don't indict but suggest stress. In the aftermath, the room went still behind tape. The instruments powered down. The screen that blinked green now held a frozen prompt waiting for an input that would never come. A lab built on control was now a crime scene, and as responders wheeled the stretcher away, the cameras kept their unemotional watch. From scene to suspect profiles, the narrative began to form not from what people said, but from what the systems had already recorded. Start with the surface, celebrated, charismatic, boundary-pushing. The professor's CV read like a staircase with no missing steps, fast promotions, keynote slots, glowing profiles that framed them as a builder of people as much as a builder of data. In rooms with donors, they spoke in clean arcs. In rooms with students, they spoke in specifics that made you feel seen. The combination built a persona that repelled doubt. Under that polish lived a different operating system. Control of information, not just curation. They centralized raw data to protect IP, collected notebooks for synthesis, and decided who saw what and when. Selective warmth did the rest. Praise as an accelerant, distance as a brake. You can map the pattern across years, pull promising trainees close, give them access and identity, then keep the funnel narrow enough that loyalty feels like survival. The psychological profile fits a familiar template in high-prestige environments. Entitlement wrapped in service language, image preservation masquerading as stewardship. Compartmentalization so practiced that conflicting roles, mentor and evaluator, partner and superior, felt to them like honest complexity rather than coercion. If you asked them then, they'd say they were demanding because the work mattered. If you pressed on rules, they'd tell a story about innovation outpacing bureaucracy. Think about this in terms of motive formation. Exposure wasn't a reputational bruise for them. It was annihilation. The lab's success was their identity scaffold. If the scaffold cracked, affair, after-hours access, figure irregularities, the self they sold in every room tilted. That fear converts to action in people who believe they alone hold the project together. They don't see harm. They see necessary containment. Moving from persona to behavior, look at their language on the morning of the discovery. Within minutes before toxicology, they framed the death as a tragic accident and pointed at culture, mislabeled reagents, shared culpability. Passive voice, diffused agency. Investigators flag that because it assigns the cause to environment, not decision. It's also strategic. A lab accident is a safety story. A targeted exposure is homicide. Control showed up in small administration choices. They held the shared key narrative as efficiency. They discouraged direct responses to compliance, insisting on in-person alignment. They shifted meetings off campus to avoid interruptions, a phrase that removes witnesses under the pretense of focus. Each move reduced external eyes. Each move made their version of events the default. Colleagues describe a person who could toggle instantly, warm in a hallway, cold at a challenge. In the profile, that's not volatility, it's calibration. They read power in a room and adjusted. When the rival raised duplication in a public forum cloaked as praise, the professor praised rigorous calibration rather than answer the embedded question. When compliance asked for logs, they drafted, deleted, drafted again, searching for a phrasing that could hold two truths: irregular hours and the need to deny intent. What about remorse? In interviews, they expressed shock and care for the student's family. They did not admit the affair. They called private mentorship intensive guidance. They spoke of sacrifice and standards. The avoidance wasn't random. Admitting the relationship undercut every letter they'd written and every evaluation they'd signed. It also reframed every request they'd made of the student, including late-night edits, as coercive. That's legal exposure layered on psychological exposure. Consider the access pattern. Maintenance windows at 2:00 a.m. aren't general knowledge. Faculty controlling instrument downtime know them because they request them. The entries clustered inside those 90 seconds of controller reboot. If someone exploited that gap, the knowledge came from privilege within the system. Privilege isn't guilt. It's proximity to the lever. In a motive model, proximity plus fear creates opportunity. There's a telling micro-story from years earlier, long before this lab. A junior tech missed a control, and the professor reran the experiment overnight, then presented the clean result as proof of the tech's training success. The tech kept the job. The paper looked fine. The story calcified into lore. The professor protects their people and gets results. Translate that forward, when the audit email landed, the reflex would be the same. Shield the team, shape the record, keep the narrative intact. But the stakes now included a relationship that couldn't withstand daylight. From their perspective, the affair wasn't coercion. It was connection that grew in an intense context. That's how they justified it to themselves. The problem is, consent inside hierarchy isn't a private evaluation. It's a structural fact. When the student set a boundary, we need to stop. Or, I go to compliance. The professor confronted a choice between surrendering control and preserving it. The preservation path required speed, access, and a delivery method that looked like routine. Investigators watched for defensive shifts, retaining counsel early, channeling all questions through the department, declining to share raw files while invoking IP. Those moves aren't admissions, they're posture. The cumulative effect told a story, a person who treats scrutiny as a threat to be managed, not a process to be served. So, does the profile support escalation to violence? Not impulsive violence. Instrumental action. If you accept that exposure equaled identity collapse, then a plan to neutralize the source of exposure fits the internal logic. Preempt, control the scene, claim accident, survive the audit. Cold calculation beneath mentorship language. It's not cinematic rage. It's a risk equation solved the wrong way. Start with origin. First-generation striver. The kind who learned early that access isn't given, it's performed for. Their transcript read like a climb, scholarships, lab awards, peer-reviewed co-authorships before most students found their footing. In interviews, mentors use the same phrase, relentless. That's the trait departments celebrate. It's also the trait that makes a person vulnerable to a gatekeeper who promises acceleration. The lab became family. Not metaphor, routine. Holidays spent on prep runs, birthdays marked by cake in the break room between incubator checks. When you live inside that cadence, identity fuses with outcomes. A good day is a clean run. A bad day is personal failure. The professor didn't create that drive. They harvested it. They offered proximity, praise, and access that made the student feel chosen. Ambition has a cost curve. At first, the price is sleep. Then, social ties. Then boundaries. The student paid in order. Late nights to hit milestones, silence when peers joked about favoritism, agreement when the professor reframed a rule as friction. They told themselves it was temporary. Get through the grant cycle. Collect the letter. Launch. That's how you justify a compromise when the end looks near. Now listen to their private voice notes. This is where you hear the split. I'm proud of this work, they said in one, but I'm ashamed of how we're doing some of it. Pride and shame coexisting is the tell of someone trapped between values and incentives. They weren't confessing fraud. They were admitting drift, log edits to align with daytime, pilot runs folded into polished figures, shared sessions that blurred authorship. Each act felt small. Together, they bent the arc. Their relationship with the professor followed the same physics. A boundary crossed under the label of mentorship, then normalized through closeness and scarcity. When the student tried to reset the line, short texts about meeting only on campus during daylight, the professor softened and pulled them back with warmth and promises. Protection from politics, first author, introductions to donors. The brief break that followed didn't hold. The student returned, telling themselves they were choosing opportunity, not dependency. Consider external stakes. Their stipend supported family. Their visa-holding teammates' future hinged on the lab's compliance. Their cohort's timelines depended on the grant's continuity. The student carried those weights like a ledger in their head. Reporting misconduct meant detonating a room full of people they cared about. That calculus kept them quiet longer than their conscience wanted. But conscience doesn't cancel under pressure. It adapts. The student began saving originals, access logs, instrument caches, email threads, like guardrails against a story being rewritten without them. They labeled nothing insurance, but that's what it was, a locked box with a second key. It wasn't a plan to expose. It was a plan to be believed if exposure happened. In the profile, they weren't naive about power. They understood hierarchy. They also believed stubbornly that excellence could buy them a path out of dependence. That belief made them push harder when the audit email landed. They drafted careful language, accuracy, rationale, trying to bend the narrative toward truth without shattering it. When the professor pressed to make the records reflect, the student's voice note captured the pivot. I don't think I agreed to this. Let's map their behavior to timeline. After the freezer anomaly, they asked questions quietly. After the grant tightened, they extended hours. After the audit ping, they saved originals. After the brown bag, they began preparing for daylight confrontation. The voicemail. The night before was the first explicit line. Stop, or I go to compliance. That wasn't an impulsive threat. It was a boundary set by someone who'd rehearsed the consequences and accepted them. Why push then? Because relationship and data had converged. The affair's secrecy now overlapped with irregular figures and access anomalies. If the student stayed silent, they risked complicity. If they spoke, they risked the professor's retaliation and the system's tendency to blame the junior party. They chose a third path: document, then demand a transparent meeting with records present. It was a move rooted in faith that process, once activated, could still work. There's a small human detail in their notebook from the week before. A margin note next to a protocol step. Trust the method. Underlined twice. That's not about chemistry, it's about ethics. Trusting the method means trusting that verification matters more than a clean slide. It means trusting that telling the truth won't end you. The student underlined it because they were trying to make it true. Peers described them as generous with time and stingy with complaint. They taught techniques, shared reagents, covered early morning slots for others. They did not gossip about the professor. Even when rumors swirled, they steered away. That restraint is consistent with someone who separates private struggle from public duty. It's also consistent with someone planning a formal report rather than a whisper. So, motive from their side? Not sabotage, not self-harm. Exposure of misconduct to reclaim autonomy. A clean break from a relationship that had become leverage. Preservation of work they believed in, without the rot of edits and midnight windows. When investigators aligned their saved logs with system captures, the student's intent became legible. Protect the science, then protect the self. The cost kept accruing. Sleep debt, isolation, the slow erosion of self-worth when praise is tied to compliance. And still, they drew a line. The voicemail is short because the mind, under strain, trims to essentials. Stop, or I report. That sentence put them in danger because it threatened the professor's identity scaffold. It also clarified the students. They weren't a proxy for someone else's ambition. They were a scientist insisting on daylight. Now let's look at the mechanics of the crime. Cause of death determines whether you're dealing with negligence or intent. 3 pathways sat on the table: ingestion poison, inhalation asphyxiant, or contact sabotage. Start with ingestion. It's intuitive. Spike a drink, wait. But the scene fights that. Eyewash activation tells you the exposure felt sudden and external. People don't sprint to an eyewash for a bitter sip. They do when eyes or skin burn, or when vapors hit the mucous membranes and panic floods the body. The mug matters, but maybe not as a cup, as a carrier. Consider inhalation. The lab worked. With a class of high-tox reagents that volatilize under room conditions if mishandled. A punctured vial or an unsealed aliquot can create a local cloud. Yet responders found no puddle, no UV reactive splash, and the room didn't reek. Air samples taken minutes after discovery read elevated, but not catastrophic. That profile suggests microdose delivery at intimate range, not a broad release. Think whisper, not shout. Which brings us to contact sabotage, a contaminated surface that the victim always touches. The workstation was consistent: same bench, same pipette rack, same mug, chipped at the handle. Forensics swabbed the mug's rim and interior curve. Initial screens flagged coffee oils, unsurprising, and trace of a compound in the same family as the missing reagent. Coffee oils aren't noise, they're a conveyor. Lipids bind and carry residues, and the thin, glossy ring under the lip is where skin meets ceramic. A transfer point. Now, the pipettes. Tips from the student's rack went into sealable tubes. Particle analysis later showed microscopic droplets with mixed signatures, coffee oil fraction, plus a toxin residue at levels just above detection. If you're loading a tip with contaminant and staging it in the rack, you risk leaving a trail on the bench. But the bench swab returned low signal, while the mug's inner lip returned higher. That ratio argues the mug, not the rack, was primary. Inhalation still whispers at the edges because the eyewash ran. Eyes burn when volatile compounds flash off a film. Imagine a gloved hand lifts the mug, tilts it back to rinse, then sets it down. The residue sits on the inner lip. The next touch brings that residue to mouth and nose. A faint vapor forms at contact warmth. The victim inhales, coughs, eyes sting, eyewash yanked. Collapse fast between checks on a protocol sheet. Timing fits. What about a tainted carafe or shared kettle? The common station was tested. Negative for target compound. No other mugs on the rack showed residue. Narrowing the field, investigators asked, who could stage a single personalized object without raising alarms? Someone with private access at the precise window. The door loses vigilance. Someone who knows the victim's habits, their mug, their bench, their sequence before a run. A mock forensic report reconstructed the likely timeline. At 1:58 a.m., door held during maintenance blink. At 2:03, a faint ceramic clink on the corridor mic, consistent with a mug placed, not dropped. At 2:06, motion at the student's bench. At 2:12, eyewash activation. At 2:14, silent alarm resolves the mismatch. Active room, unexpected user pattern. From exposure to panic, less than 2 minutes. That's a short arc aligned with fast-acting contact toxins affecting respiration and ocular surfaces. The reagent ledger gap points to a specific class. Organophosphate analogs repurposed in micro quantities for research. They don't require ingestion to disable. Skin or mucus, membrane contact suffices. In trace form, they ride oils well, resist casual rinsing, and volatilize enough to irritate eyes. If you were careless, your gloves would carry it everywhere. If you were deliberate, you'd localize to one object and one user. Defense would argue cross-contamination. A mislabeled vial, a sloppy rinse, an exhausted scientist rushing. Chain of custody, they'd say, is fragile around small, lipophilic residues. Investigators anticipated that and doubled redundancies. They compared baseline swabs from adjacent benches, from the common kettle handle, from the eyewash pull. Only the mug and 2 pipette tips showed the compound above noise. The eyewash handle showed diluted traces consistent with the victim's hands, not a source. There's also the pattern evidence. Maintenance windows exploited with precision, badge logs that don't align with claimed users, the spare key that bypassed the camera's best angle, the mug's position within reach when the victim followed their routine. These aren't accidents assembling themselves, they're choices. Meanwhile, something else was happening outside the chemistry. Digital forensics identified the instrument session as a shared, still open account from daytime, masking the nighttime initiator. That erases authorship unless you have a second trail. The students' saved originals provided that second trail, timestamps and cache artifacts that pinned start times against door states. The overlay shrank the plausible window for tampering to the maintenance blink, plus 90 seconds of hold. Impact is clear. Investigators narrowed the mechanism to deliberate contamination of a personal object at a personal workstation during a known surveillance gap. Not poison in a potion, not a rogue plume. A calculated, intimate delivery system designed to read like routine, then like accident. The MO points to someone who understands lab behavior patterns, surveillance cadence, and the chemistry of trace. And it turns a homicide into a story told through a mug's glossy ring and the thin line of water running from an eyewash to a grate. The lab had another entrance, the kind you don't notice until you're looking for exits. A maintenance corridor ran behind the suite, lined with gray paint, conduit, and a steel fire door that didn't face any camera directly. No glossy hallway shots. Just a door sensor tied to an old controller that logged states, but not faces. If you understood the building, you understood that this was the softer edge. Facilities called it the side door. Security called it low priority. Investigators called it opportunity. The sensor wrote its blunt diary: closed, open, held, ajar. When they pulled 6 weeks of events, the side door patterns echoed the main. Brief, held states near 2 a.m. aligned with maintenance reboots. That wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. If you held the bar during a controller restart, the system treated the door like a patient until it resynced. 90 seconds of indifference. Now, the shadow swipe. At 1:58 a.m. on the critical night, the door controller recorded an attempted credential read from a badge ID flagged deactivated. It shouldn't even register, but the legacy firmware cached UIDs before validation, so the log kept a ghost of the attempt, no access granted, just a fingerprint of the try. The system labeled it a shadow swipe. The next line read, held, then open. No authorized card followed. Someone timed the push to ride the reboot and the held latch. Investigators asked facilities when they'd last audited revocations. The contractor admitted what many institutions live with. Revocations propagate in batches, not instantly, especially across older panels. Deactivated didn't mean erased everywhere. It meant should be, with a delay that could last hours on a busy night. Gaps like that aren't exotic. They're mundane, which is why insiders exploit them. To understand who, look at who could have known the side door's behavior. Custodial knew the corridor, but not the maintenance windows. IT knew the reboots, but not the lab's rhythms. The professor had calendar access for downtime and a reason to prefer quiet entries no camera watched. The student used the main door and didn't carry a master key. That's the profile split. Who needed stealth, who assumed legitimacy. They dusted the push bar and pulled a partial palm print along the edge where hands slide when you lean without thinking. Partial prints are teases. This one matched no single person. It matched a shared common area, a lounge countertop that a dozen people touch daily. Contamination or coincidence? It didn't move the needle. The absence of a clean match frustrated the team, but the door's mechanical history told a different story. Its hydraulic closer had been adjusted 2 weeks earlier to slow the swing, documented in a maintenance ticket. Slower swing means longer ajar states when someone eases it. Someone had noticed and used that grace. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the digital layer. The side door controller ran a firmware 2 versions behind. It logged time locally and reconciled to the server every 5 minutes. If you slipped in during a maintenance blink and left within that window, the event order could shuffle when uploaded. In practice, that meant the exact sequence, shadow swipe, hold, open, might appear with a minor drift. Investigators compensated by anchoring to the main corridor camera's clock. Even with drift, the overlap held. There was also the question of the badge itself. Who owned the deactivated card? Records tied it to a research assistant whose stipend came through a consultancy linked to the professor's sibling. On paper, they'd left months ago. In reality, their card's UID lived like a ghost in the system, rejectable but legible. The consultancy dissolved overnight when subpoenas landed, a move that looked less like guilt and more like a reflex to make paper trails vanish. Reflexes tell you mentality: contain, erase, move on. Consider intent versus opportunism. If someone stumbled on the side door's weakness, entries would be sloppy, random times, uneven intervals. Here, entries clung to the 2 a.m. blink like iron filings to a magnet. That's planning. If you plan, you scout. Stairwell cameras caught a figure testing the bar a week earlier. Press, release, glance at a watch, leave. No bag, no tote, just timing. The person wore campus-issue hoodie and gloves. Generic. The kind of uniform anonymity a faculty member can buy at the bookstore to stop being recognized by silhouette. Critics might argue, couldn't this be the rival? They were late in the building, and their assistant appeared twice as an unknown observer. But the side corridor fed from a service elevator keyed to faculty and facilities. The rival's lab sat on another branch. Their badges didn't open that elevator after hours. Access reports back that up. The rival had motive to expose, not access to enter. What about the student? Their pattern was open, not furtive. They swiped the main door, waved at the corridor camera, and worked in the light. When they pushed boundaries, they wrote it down. Backups, voice notes, the voicemail. The side door is the opposite temperament. It's for people who prefer to edit the record before anyone else sees it. Impact matters. The side door widened the field from who swiped to who understood frailty. In interviews, the professor described building quirks with practiced ease, told stories about rescuing experiments during outages by working with the building, not against it. That line tracks. If you treat the building like a collaborator, you notice its cycles. If you're desperate, you schedule around them. In the aftermath of these findings, security patched the firmware, overlapped camera views, and tightened revocation latency. Necessary, late. For this case, the side door is motive's ally, a path away from eyes, a sensor that speaks in hints, a weak hinge between procedure and practice. The shadow swipe doesn't name the hand, it names the playbook. Learn the lag, hold the door, move the mug, and let the system tell a story where nobody seems to enter at all. Interrogations are about language under pressure. You listen for posture, not poetry. The professor sat first, counsel adjacent, water untouched. The transcript opens with a neutral prompt. Walk me through your morning. Their answer used distance. A colleague alerted me. I arrived to find responders managing an incident. Incident, managing. Passive voice spreads accountability thin. When asked about after-hours work, they reframed. Calibration occasionally extends beyond posted times to ensure stability. Occasionally. Stability. It's policy language, not memory. The real question is, how do they handle specifics? Did you authorize entries between 1:45 and 2:30 a.m.? We maintain flexibility for sensitive protocols. Not yes, not no. A glide path. When shown the side door log, a shadow swipe, a held latch, they pivoted. Facilities doors are unreliable during maintenance. Machines fail. People don't act. That's the implication. Investigators countered with the maintenance calendar access list. The professor adjusted. I'm looped in to mitigate disruptions. Loop, mitigate, disrupt. Verbs that keep them at altitude. Moving from the scene to the suspect's profile, watch pronoun shifts. We appears when outcomes shine. They appears when systems falter. We achieved stability. They scheduled reboots. It's a control tell. Asked about the relationship, they denied impropriety. Intensive mentorship can be misconstrued. The line is designed to sound reasonable. It also avoids power. When pressed on the voicemail, they claimed ignorance. I hadn't reviewed messages, counsel interjected. My client will not comment on personal communications. The wall went up right where motive lives. The rival entered without counsel, energy bright, answers crisp. I requested raw traces. I noticed duplicated baseline noise. I flagged it. That's my duty. The eagerness read as performance. When asked about late-night presence, they volunteered their alibi before the question finished. I was on the 4th floor, elevator logs confirm, and my assistant left at 2:20. Overcompensation is a tell, but not a crime. They hinted at culture. Everyone knows that lab runs hot, then walked it back. I mean, they're productive. Agenda leaks, then covers itself. The rival's assistant, soft-spoken, grounded. I saw lights on some nights. I didn't enter. I noticed figure patterns in posters. They described methods, overlays, metadata checks, without flourish. When shown the corridor still with a waiting figure on one night, they nodded. That was me. I waited for a friend. It matched a time-stamped text. No grand reveal, just small checkable truths. Investigators like that, it calibrates the witness. Lab mates split along predictable seams. One senior trainee, loyal, minimized. We all keep odd hours. The professor cares about safety. Asked about logs, they said, I assumed the PI handled reporting. Assumed is a pressure word. It floats responsibility. Another trainee, peripheral, faltered. We probably logged that Wednesday. Probably is how memory bends when risk rises. They mentioned a shared session left open to save time, then corrected themselves. To streamline. The fix is worse than the slip. Now, the professor again, later in the day, confronted with the side door key found taped under their desk drawer after a warrant. It's for emergencies. Emergencies undefined. Who else knew? No one. Absolute answers are brittle. When shown residue on the key that matched the door push bar compound, they stepped back. I'm not a materials expert. Deflection by domain? Investigators weren't asking for chemistry. They were asking for access. There's a single line in the transcripts that opens a new angle. The student's closest colleague, voice low, eyes down. They told me last week, we were done. Past tense. Done with what? The private meetings. It was an admission spoken sideways. They said if it didn't stop, they'd go to compliance. That aligns with the voicemail we know existed but hadn't been heard at the time. The phrase, we were done, became a hinge. It reframed motive from stress to control loss. Consider vocal cadence under pressure. The professor accelerated when challenged, then slowed to reframe. The rival sped up in triumph, slowed when confronted with their own data grab pre-complaint. Labmates stuttered at boundaries. What they saw, what they inferred, what they feared. Investigators use those rhythms like a metronome. Deviations mark hotspots. Meanwhile, something else was happening off mic. Counsel requested all questions about the donor dinner go through them in writing. Why the dinner? Trace fibers on the mug, match napkins from that venue. The professor's explanation, I attend many events. I couldn't say where fibers originate. It's technically true and strategically useless. The small detail stood there, unclaimed. Impact in the room? The accident narrative thinned. The control narrative thickened. The we shrank to I when the key surfaced. The calibration defense frayed against the maintenance window choreography. The rival remained unsympathetic but non-homicidal. The assistant's clarity insulated them from conspiracy. And that one line, we were done, gave investigators permission to look at the relationship as the fulcrum, not the footnote. In the aftermath, they turned to the students' backups. If the words were hedged, the data wouldn't be. Data lives two lives, the curated version that faces the world and the raw timeline that never expected to be seen. The student kept both. Investigators imaged the external drive they'd labeled innocuously, then mounted a mirrored folder tree in a lab. Inside, instrument caches, autosave fragments, access CSVs, email attachments frozen with their metadata intact. It was the kind of archive you build when you don't trust the narrative to hold. Start with the instrument caches. Shared sessions obscure authorship, but cache artifacts don't lie about time. Every autosave left a breadcrumb, temporary project files stamped down to the second. Overlaid with the building's preserved access logs, those stamps traced a spine through the night. An autosave at 2:17:12, another at 2:18:59, both occurring while the main account name sat generic. That spine matched door state transitions. Open, held, closed. The double life collapsed into one timeline. Then the access CSVs. Compliance had emailed a spreadsheet. The student kept a pristine copy and exported their own from the door server before edits. In the student's file, Entries showed as they happened. 1. 5803 side door, shadow swipe. 2. Pestaodort 04 controller reboot. 2. Gazdaonar 06 held. 2. Pezda 131 closed. In the professor's draft reply, later found in a deleted items recovery, the wording implied maintenance anomalies could appear as entries. The student's original annihilated that euphemism. These weren't anomalies. They were actions. Emails told a quieter story. Attachments from late-night exchanges packaged calibration traces that appeared in posters months later. The student's archive included the first pass traces, noisy, uneven, alongside the posted versions with smoothing notes and track changes. It wasn't headline fraud. It was cumulative polish that crossed lines, and the timestamps built a second alignment. Late-night edits, early morning uploads, midday presentations that pretended to be fresh runs. Meanwhile, something else surfaced that only a pack rat's instinct preserves. Server sync histories. The lab's file server maintained a journal of versioning. The student had exported that journal and zipped it. In it, an entry showed a folder rename at 10:42 p.m., runs and June raw, to runs and June calibration, followed by moved files at 1:59 a.m. during the maintenance blink. The system tried to reconcile, then logged deferred write, the kind of message you ignore until it matters. Tonight, it mattered. It placed fingers on a keyboard in a window when nobody was supposed to be at a terminal. There was also a set of screenshots the student had taken of the reagent ledger page the week prior, before any gap. The images weren't for drama, they were for a planned compliance packet. When investigators compared those screenshots to the ledger captured after the death, the high-tox handle with barrier row had a faint indentation where initials should have been. A clean space, then nothing. You can't initial after the fact without ink shining. The absence gleamed. Consider how the student organized the archive. A folder named Protocols Refs held PDFs, but also a text file called Clarifications, .txt. Inside, bullet points for a future meeting, actual run windows versus reported, shared session policy, non-lab meetings, boundaries, daylight only. Calm, precise. The plan wasn't to explode. It was to document, then insist on accuracy. The double life of data wasn't a trap. It was a bridge back to method. Digital forensics approached the drive like a crime scene. Hash values matched across duplicates, no tampering. Timestamps aligned to the device clock, which had drifted by 42 seconds. They corrected for drift using the campus email server time-on sent messages. The corrected overlay snapped into place with the preserved CCTV frames. The corridor lights flick at 1:50. The autosave hits 2 minutes later. Precision mattered because the defense would say, close enough is not proof. Here, close became exact. The impact was immediate. Compliance, now co-working with investigators, recognized systematic backdating across weeks, not every entry. Enough to mark intent, a pattern of shifting after-hours work into daytime folders, relabeling pilot as calibration, smoothing baselines that reappeared like fingerprints. The professor's accident narrative started to curve toward obstruction. Because if you're willing to edit the scientific record to fit expectations, a jury can accept you might edit a physical scene to do the same. But there was one more file that tightened the noose. A small audio note created the day of the audit email, never sent. In it, the student talks through the plan. Save originals, note rationale. Ask for a daylight meeting. If pushed to edit, decline. Then, a line that hadn't appeared elsewhere. Spare key rumored under desk. If true, that's how the side door is used. It wasn't evidence of access, it was evidence of knowledge. And a breadcrumb that led to a warrant and the key taped under the drawer. Critically, the drive contained a cloud export manifest, the same folders mirrored to an encrypted cloud account, time-stamped hours before the death. That duplication undercut any claim that files were planted later. The double life had insurance. Even if one copy vanished, the other would testify. And when forensic examiners pulled the cloud version, they found a hidden text file created minutes after the voicemail. 10 a.m. meeting. Bring originals. You can feel the intention through a screen. The case pivoted. From accidental exposure to targeted silencing backed by a record of manipulation. The raw timeline gave the systems a voice louder than anyone in a room. It also created risk. If data could tell this story, could it have been spoofed? Investigators braced for that argument. Then, the next turn arrived from a place nobody expected. A device neither the professor nor the student had claimed, pinging near the lab with messages that didn't belong to either of them. The first clean fracture in the case didn't come from a lab bench. It came from radio silence that wasn't silent at all. Cellular tower logs near the science complex showed a device that didn't belong to the professor or the student waking up twice in the critical window. Brief pings, then dark. It wasn't a random passerby. The device's pattern matched intent. Arrive, check signal, go quiet inside concrete. Digital forensics pulled the tower maps and carved the campus into sectors. The third device, unregistered, prepaid, hit the same sector that covered the service corridor and side door. On a normal night, that sector's noise was a handful of custodial phones and one vending machine modem. On this night, the burst stood out like a flare. Moving from the scene to the suspect's profile, investigators asked a simple question: who benefits from a separate channel? If you plan around maintenance windows and held latches, you don't leave your primary phone married to your movement. You compartmentalize. One device for life, one for risk. They went hunting for the handset. Building access points had been upgraded months earlier. Each AP logged anonymized device fingerprints, max salted by privacy features, but still patternable across hours. On the night before the death, one unfamiliar fingerprint joined the network for 9 seconds near the south stairwell, then vanished. That 9-second handshake would have been noise if not for timing. The professor's office held the next clue. A box in a backup closet, paper files, spare power bricks, conference lanyards, and beneath them, a small phone still in packaging, SIM-clipped from its card. It had never joined campus Wi-Fi. It had messaged, though. When powered, the lock screen showed a generic wallpaper and no missed calls. The message app wiped. That's not unusual for someone who learns fast. But the phone number still lived in carrier records, subpoenaed metadata pulled threads. The third number exchanged texts with a lab tech months earlier about cleaning logs. Not dramatic. Vague enough to argue innocence. But the tech's own phone records told a different story. Replies sent while the tech's device was geolocated off campus, at home, 2 hours after the professor's box phone pinged near the lab. Either the tech wrote from bed, or messages were forwarded, spoofed, or scheduled through a web interface. The timestamps didn't line up with physics. Consider motive. If you're consolidating control, you corral communications. A burner creates deniability. It also creates artifacts. Carrier-side logs don't care about app deletions. They care about towers and seconds. Forensics stitch those seconds into a timeline that overlapped the side door's held state. At 1:57 a.m., the third phone hit Sector B, the same slice of building as the service corridor. At 2:04, it left. The professor's personal phone remained silent, asleep on Do Not Disturb. The student's phone stayed on the lab's Wi-Fi. Meanwhile, something else was happening underground. Payment records showed several small donor fund transfers routed to a consultancy tied to the professor's sibling, the same entity that sponsored the research assistant whose deactivated badge left a shadow swipe. Prepaid SIMs purchased in cash flagged a convenience store 5 blocks from campus. Receipts, kept under the counter, now turned over. One receipt's timestamp matched the week the maintenance windows became the lab's routine. Money, access, timing. It's not a confession, it's a geometry. Investigators tested the professor's found phone for residue, hoping for a direct link. Trace from the door bar, the lab bench, The mug. Nothing landed clean. But inside the box was a microfiber pouch with faint particles consistent with the donor dinner napkins. The same fiber signature later found on the mug. Trace isn't handwriting. It's proximity. You don't convict on fibers. You orient. Here's where the twist sharpened. The third phone had one contact stored as initials. That contact number mapped to the lab tech who had left months earlier. When questioned, the tech produced their own messages, screenshots with timestamps that didn't match carrier logs. Their explanation: I backed up, restored. The phone changed time zones. Technical fog. Possible sometimes, used here as a blanket. What nobody knew at the time, the handset ID of the third phone had appeared in campus telemetry 2 weeks prior near the same stairwell. Then, not again. Someone tested the route before the night. They learned where signal drops. They learned where to pause. The profile tightened around premeditation. Impact in the room. Doubt bloomed and then split. Was the professor operating a second device to orchestrate access and messaging, or had someone planted a decoy to frame them? The defense would later argue the latter, that rivals with motive to smear seeded a phone and a trail. But the towers don't care about rivalry. They draw circles around presence, and those circles sat on top of doors that opened without a name. Investigators kept their posture. The third phone wasn't a smoking gun. It was a map that expanded the suspect net beyond psychology into logistics. It said, this wasn't chaos. It was a plan with layers, card shadows, maintenance blinks, a side door, and a line of text that looked like housekeeping but walked like control. The twist didn't acquit anyone, it forced a pivot. Stop arguing only about who was in the lab. Start following the money that paid for the gaps and the hands that moved it. Because when messages lie, bank ledgers don't flinch. When messages get messy, you follow what doesn't improvise. Money. Transfers keep their own diary, and this one started in the development office with a pledge that moved faster than protocols ever do. Donor funds earmarked for method acceleration took a detour. Not illegal on paper, just a consultancy invoice with clean language and a familiar last name. The consultancy belonged to the professor's sibling, a firm with no lab space, no equipment, and a website that listed Strategic Scientific Services. The invoices read like fog: workflow optimization, data harmonization, phrases that could mean anything or nothing, sums under thresholds that trigger extra review, 5 figures split across quarters, always just below the line where committee eyes sharpen. Meanwhile, the lab's purchasing logs showed no corresponding hardware. If you optimize workflow without tools or people, you're buying silence or access. Consider the research assistant who never appeared on payroll. Small stipends landed monthly from the consultancy, memoed as field support. HR had no record of an appointment. Security had a record of a badge created months back, set to expire, then deactivated. That UID is the one that left a shadow swipe on the side door. The name matched the consultancy's payee. On paper, an off-site helper. In practice, a ghost credential with a path into the building. Subpoenas pulled bank statements into the light. Money moved from donor fund to consultancy, then to the assistant's account, then back out in cash withdrawals that lined up with prepaid SIM purchases at that corner store. The receipts were anonymous. The timestamps weren't. One lined up with the week the maintenance blink became a habit. Another sat hours before the third phone's first campus ping. Money drew a triangle, donor to sibling to a shadow actor intersecting access and communications. Meanwhile, the consultancy dissolved overnight when the first subpoena landed, not a wind down, a vanishing. Articles of dissolution filed at dawn, registered agent unreachable by noon. Documents go dark when people expect light. Investigators read that as reflexive containment, a behavior consistent with the professor's posture in every other domain. Control the narrative, close the door, manage the risk. Development emails added texture. The professor wrote privately of private promises on timelines that outpaced the formal grant's 6-week milestones. Donors like velocity. Velocity invites shortcuts. In one thread, a staffer asked whether the consultancy could bridge capacity. The professor replied, "They understand our needs." The phrase can be benign. Here, it bridged donor pressure to a siblings company that, in turn, bankrolled access manipulation. Consider motive through finance. If exposure threatens identity, then preserving the lab's momentum is preserving the self. Quiet payments aren't just about skimming, they're infrastructure for control. Pay an off-book assistant, keep a badge alive in the margins, route sensitive tasks away from HR and into a private ledger. You reduce eyes, you increase leverage. When a crisis arrives, the same architecture that hides a stipend can hide a plan. Audit trails inside the university system weren't built for this. They reconcile grants to deliverables, not deliverables to ethics. The consultancy invoices match budget line items with elegant vagueness. Only when forensics overlaid access logs and tower pings with bank transfers did the pattern stop looking like coincidence and start looking like choreography. A payment hit, a phone lit, a door held. The cadence repeated enough to matter. The defense would later argue these were routine external services, that academia relies on contractors, that family. Businesses serve institutions every day, true in the abstract. But abstractions don't leave shadow swipes at 1:58 a.m. or dissolve at 6:07 a.m. when records get interested. And abstractions don't match the UID of a deactivated badge to the stipend recipient listed on the consultancy ledger. One micro-story anchors the scheme. A procurement clerk flagged a duplicate vendor address. Consultancy and siblings' personal address matched. They sent a polite query. The response came not from the consultancy, but from the professor, CCing development, praising the firm's agility and asking to avoid bottlenecks. The clerk processed the invoice. Agility is a flattering word for bypass. Meanwhile, something else. A petty cash reimbursement for catering for late-night team sprint. The receipt showed coffee and pastries purchased at 1:31 a.m. The card used belonged to the consultancy. The signature was the stipend recipient's. The timestamp sat inside the same window as stairwell camera motion on a non-delivery night. It placed the assistant in the building after hours with a perfectly normal explanation. Food. But the lab doesn't allow food at benches. That receipt doesn't prove contamination. It proves presence and comfort with bending rules. Impact is structural. Funding became the quiet engine behind access manipulation. Donor pressure set the tempo. The consultancy floated the off-book roll. The stipends kept the shadow actor tethered. The prepaid SIMs enabled compartmentalized communications. When the student drew a boundary, that machine was already built. It did what machines do. It ran. Investigators didn't need the money trail to prove intent. The chemistry and the doors already spoke, but finance closed loops. It showed a professor who didn't improvise a night. They funded a system over months that reduced friction for any covert act they chose to perform. Edit logs, steer access, set a mug. When subpoenas hit and the consultancy blinked out, the narrative settled. This wasn't a single bad night. It was a budget line for control. Cases turn on what refuses to fit. In a room full of expected polymers and routine dust, one fiber said, "Elsewhere." The glove bagged by the sink carried a trace filament, dyed a saturated slate woven with a subtle diagonal that lab nitrile never sheds. Under the microscope, the cross-section showed a trilobal synthetic used to keep napkins crisp at high-end venues. Development pulled a sample set from the donor dinner vendor. Match, not identity, but family. A fiber traveled from linen to hand to glove to sink. That's proximity crossing scenes. Then the mug's lip told a second story. Particle analysis lifted coffee oils, as we knew, But mixed into that sheen were microgranular residues that carried the same fiber's dye molecules in trace. That means contact with a textile before contact with ceramic. The professor's habit, pocketing a napkin, sounds quaint until dye molecules ride onto a mug that never left the lab. The lab manager swore by the rule, no outside cloths at benches. Rules don't stop particles. People do. Or don't. Now, the pipette tip. One from the student's rack carried a film with 2 signatures, lipid fraction, and a toxin residue. Forensics ran GCMS and found peaks consistent with the missing reagent's analog. But embedded in that film were silica microparticles that didn't match lab-grade wipes. They matched a commercial coffee grinder dust, trace silicate from mass-market burrs, detectable when you know what to ask. The lab didn't grind beans. The donor dinner's caterer did. Coffee oils plus grinder dust plus toxin residue is a chain that reads like a commute. Dinner to office to mug to mouth. Defense would say, transfer contamination. A fiber falls, a mug sits, a hand brushes. That's why you map the path. Investigators reconstructed it with a simple walk. The professor leaves the dinner carrying a cloth napkin. Fibers cling to fingers. Back at the office, they set the napkin in a bag with the silenced phone. Later, during the maintenance blink gloved, they handle the mug at the student's bench. The glove's exterior now carries dinner fibers. The mug's lip carries both fibers and oil that bind the residue. You don't need a spill. You need touch plus timing. Meanwhile, something else surfaced on the bench's underside. An adhesive smear, clear to the eye, but under IR it fluoresced in a pattern consistent with a specific brand of reusable lab tape. The lab stock matched, but the smear included a faint particulate absent from the stock roll. Cellulose fragments from a paper towel grade used by catering kitchens, not the lab's lint-free supply. The smear sat exactly where a hand would brace to reach across and place a mug within easy grasp. Small, quiet, decisive. Critically, the eyewash grate trapped a single hair, short, treated with product residue that included a silicone blend the student didn't use, verified from their apartment samples provided by consent. The blend matched a salon brand common in travel kits found in the professor's drawer. Again, not identity, but the circle tightens. The hair's root was missing, no DNA, but the product signature joined the growing choir of not from here. Consider the counter-argument. A lab is a magnet for outside trace. True. That's why comparative baselines matter. Investigators swabbed 3 adjacent benches, the common kettle, the door jambs, and the corridor rail. No dinner-grade napkin fiber outside the student's station. Grinder silicates didn't appear anywhere but the mug and 2 tips. The silicone hair product registered only on the eyewash grate. Randomness rarely aims. The path reconstruction had to survive the chain of custody attack. It did because timestamps pinned each collection and duplicates went to an outside lab. Blind runs reached the same calls. Fiber family matched to the dinner vendor. Silicate dust profile consistent with catering grinders. Dye molecule traces on the mug lip. Even the glove polymer smear on the bench's edge. Their lab used a specific supplier with a distinct additive. The smear's FTIR spectrum carried that additive's signature. Someone gloved, then touched. The student's routine didn't include fresh gloves at that time. They donned them at step 3 in their protocol after placing the mug. This is where motive hugs method. If you want a death to read as accident, you don't introduce foreign drama. You choose a personal object, carry trace that looks like life, coffee oils, and add a contaminant that rides quietly. You move in a window when systems look away. You leave with nothing obvious spilled. The microtrace refuses to stay quiet. It speaks by not belonging. There's one more detail that tightens intent. The mug's position on the bench was 3 inches deeper than the student's habit, documented in prior CCTV clips where the camera catches a corner of their station on night runs. That extra reach forces a grip on the bench underside, right where the adhesive smear fluoresced. If you know someone's choreography, you know where their hand will land. Impact is straightforward. Microtrace anchored a narrative that had, until then, leaned on logs and psychology. It put dinner in the lab without the professor admitting it. It put a hand where a denial lived, and it connected a personal habit to a lethal delivery. Investigators didn't claim certainty from a single fiber. They claimed coherence from a constellation. And with that constellation, motive moved from plausible to practical. Every airtight case leaks somewhere. Here, the leak was time, 9 minutes and some seconds when the building looked away on purpose. It scheduled a camera reboot at 2 a.m., routine maintenance to clear buffer drift. In that window, corridor feeds dropped to black, then blue, then nothing. The software called it health. Investigators called it cover. Door controllers don't go dark exactly, they yawn. The main lab door registered door ajar from 2 South Exo 7 to 209 in Puzzle 11, a long, patient exhale. Nobody should hold a lab door open for 9 minutes. You hold it when you want airflow to balance, conversation to carry, or a window to stay open until you finish. The adjacent mic, a safety feature tucked into the ceiling tile, didn't lose power. It captured a faint ceramic clink at 203:19, not a drop, a place. The same sound pattern the baseline software tagged during earlier nights when mugs slid onto benches. Think about the choreography, maintenance countdown hits. The side door rides its own reboot, as we know. The main door gets eased open, and the ajar state starts to accrue seconds like a parking meter bleeding coins. Inside, a person places a mug within reach, deeper on the bench than habit would put it, then leaves the room quiet enough that instrument status lights become a soundtrack. It emails seeded the timing. 2 days prior, the schedule went out. 2 a.m. camera refresh, expected downtime 10 minutes. It sat on a shared calendar the professor had edit privileges on. The rival had access too, but their lab didn't sit on this controller cluster. The professor's assistant privileges allowed color tagging. The 2 a.m. slot was tagged red for lab impact. Red is a cue. You don't tag what you don't intend to notice. To test intent, investigators compared 3 other maintenance nights. Twice, the main door went ajar for under 30 seconds, someone slipping in, forgetting a shoulder, letting the closer do its job. On one night, 5 days before the death, the ajar held for 4 minutes during the reboot. No clink on the mic, no mug movement captured before the footage rolled off. A rehearsal without the prop. Meanwhile, stairwell motion sensors showed a body count of 1 in that span. 1 up, 1 down. No cluster, no chatter. The system recorded footfalls as bursts. The cadence matched faculty stride length more than a smaller trainee. It's crude, but gait leaves data. Investigators didn't hang the case on it. They used it to weight the scale. There's a second anchor, IT's internal note about a pilot firmware that staggered reboots across floors. The science building never deployed it. Centralized restarts saved labor. Consolidation is efficient until it hands a thief a window. If you know the building, you know when it blinks. The profile already told us who studies cycles like colleagues. The corridor mic's clink wasn't alone. At 2:03:41, a soft fabric scuff brushed the mic's limited range, cloth over steel. The side door's hydraulic hiss would be louder. This was smaller. A sleeve grazing a bench edge, consistent with the adhesive smear position under IR. People don't soundtrack murders. Buildings do. Defense will say, 9 minutes proves nothing. Cameras fail, doors stick. True, which is why investigators built a lattice. The ajar state overlaps with the tower ping of the third phone, with the shadow swipe, with the autosave cadence on the shared instrument account. 4 independent systems told the same story without speaking to one another. That converged timeline turns coincidence into pattern. Then there's the calendar. The professor maintained a personal schedule with donors, lab milestones, and building outages. In the exported metadata, the 2 a.m. reboot block had a private note. Plan around. It's not sinister in isolation. It becomes freighted when a round looks like a mug moved during a blackout. Consider this. If your lab runs hot, you plan around outages to avoid losing data. If your story depends on a room nobody sees, you plan around to avoid being seen. Investigators also tracked environmental controls. The air handler dipped to isolation mode during the maintenance window, as it always did. A manual override could have forced a purge, but no override registered. Whoever entered wanted the room to keep its air. That reduces noise. No sudden drafts, no doors slamming. It's a small choice that reads like comfort. The missing minutes didn't hide a face. They hid a hand. But a building is a polygraph. Even when one system sleeps, others twitch. The ajar log, the mic clink, the calendar tag, the tower ping, the side doors held latch, each is a beat. Put them together, and you hear a tempo that matches intent. Here's where the human element cuts through. The student's routine placed the mug at arm's reach, near the edge. The professor's placement sat 3 inches deeper, forcing a lean, forcing a grip under the bench where adhesive fluoresced. You can change cameras. You can't change muscle memory. The missing 10 minutes exploited machines. The rest exploited a person's habit. Impact is simple and brutal. Those minutes created a pocket where a death could be staged to read like a lab mishap. Without the preservation bucket, without the student's backups, that pocket would have stayed empty in the record. Instead, it became a frame. And in that frame, the story got sharp. Someone timed a building's blink, moved a mug, and walked away before the lights remembered to see. You can't hear the last conversation. You can only stage it from the marks it left on systems and objects. Start with position. The student's phone sits on the bench, connected to Wi-Fi. The professor's personal phone is silenced from the donor dinner, motionless, in their office. The third phone blinks near the service corridor at 1:57, then goes dark. The main door goes ajar at 2:07. Someone moves through a window the building gifted them. Badge and tower data place bodies, but cadence fills tone. The student's prior notes show a plan. Daylight meeting, originals in hand, refusal to edit. The voicemail the night before is blunt. Stop, or I go to compliance. That's not a tease. It's a boundary. It establishes what the student will say when the professor arrives. We're done. No more late nights, no more log edits. Tomorrow we meet in the open. Overlay the bench choreography. The mug deeper than habit. Adhesive smear under the edge where a reach becomes a brace. The student's routine. Check instrument parameters. Sip, adjust, record. At 2:03:19, the ceramic clink. Not a drop, a place. That sound is a stage direction for a conversation about control. Now, the beats. The professor enters low, no slam within the maintenance blink. The first lines would be soft. Contain, not concede. This isn't the place to escalate. We'll discuss in the morning. Don't overreact. The professor uses we to fold the student back into a shared story. The student answers with I, the pronoun of boundary. I sent the voicemail. I saved the originals. I won't adjust logs. The shift from we to I is a threat to someone who lives on merged identities. Consider the professor's need. Delay exposure until milestone data is public. That need converts to requests disguised as reassurance. Just align the language. Just hold off on compliance. We'll fix the record. The student has rehearsed this. Their notes anticipate the pressure points, accuracy, rationale, daylight. They repeat, tomorrow, with compliance in the room. A step closer. You see it in the microtrace path. Dinner fibers on a glove. Coffee oils on a mug lip seeded with residue. The professor, gloved, places the mug where the student will have to lean. It's a physical nudge that reads like care. Have your coffee. Let's talk. The play is to keep the scene ordinary. The student breaks the script. They don't drink, they work. Eyes drop to the protocol sheet. Hands move to the rack. Then a pause. The professor asks for the drive. Hand it over. We'll keep the original safe. The student says no. The refusal isn't loud, it's steady. That's when the professor's tone cools. Not anger. Calculation. Then fine, leave the records here. We'll review together. The student reaches for the mug to push it aside. Contact happens in seconds. Residue on the inner lip meets warmth, volatilizes enough to sting. The student inhales, coughs, eyelids flutter, hands move reflexively to the eye wash. At 2:12, the pull activates. That timing speaks. Panic hasn't erased agency. They reach for relief, not for a phone. You only reach for water when exposure feels external, not swallowed. What about words between coughs? You can't script them, but you can see choices. The professor doesn't call it in from the room. Their counsel later claims they arrived to responders. Logs show no outgoing call from the third phone. That fits a posture. Let the scene read as accident. The professor steps back, lets the eye wash run, leaves within the maintenance window before cameras remember. Meanwhile, the instrument keeps cycling. Autosaves at 2:17:12 and 2:18:59 mark a process the student started before the conversation, still ticking. That undercuts any claim of self-harm. They were mid-protocol. People planning to die don't set timers for data quality. Here's where motive and method fuse. The professor needed silence to protect identity. The delivery looked like routine, embedded in a habit. The conversation was a final attempt to pull the student back into we. The student insisted on I. The residue did the rest. Impact lands in the aftermath language. When confronted later, the professor calls it an incident, a tragic accident. Passive framing, immediate. That's the same voice they used when logs didn't align, maintenance anomalies, calibration after hours. The pattern is consistent. When control phrase, rename the moment until it fits. There's one more beat, small and human. The student's notebook, open on the bench, bears the underlined margin note from days prior. Trust the method. The line sits next to the step where they always took a sip. Tonight, they didn't. They moved the mug and reached for a valve. Trusting the method means trusting verification over narrative. The last conversation was about that fight, truth in the open versus control in the dark. One person tried to schedule daylight. The other tried to make sure daylight never arrived. The defense didn't fight the science head-on. They reframed the room. A tragedy in a pressured lab, counsel said, not a crime. Their anchor was familiar in research settings, cross-contamination. They walked the jury through shared benches, open sessions, and a culture that treats protocols as flexible under deadlines. If many hands touch the space, any one trace becomes ambiguous. That's the point. Blur authorship, blur intent. They started with the reagent. A missing vial isn't murder, the expert argued. It's inventory noise. Labs miscount. Bottles get double-logged. The professor's team introduced variability studies and error rates from comparable facilities. They stressed how organophosphate analogs can smudge across surfaces undetected, especially with lipophilic carriers like coffee oils. A smear here, a touch there, and suddenly every object looks guilty. If everything's contaminated, nothing is. Then the eyewash. Defense experts pivoted. Sudden irritation is consistent with a mislabeled bottle, they said. A tired scientist could reach for the wrong aliquot, brush their eyes, and react before realizing what happened. The timing, minutes from exposure to collapse, fit negligence just as well as malice, they argued. Negligence isn't a felony if the system's culture invited it. Chain of custody took center stage. They attacked the mug. Who bagged it? When? Was it left on the bench while responders triaged? Could airborne particulates settle? They suggested an investigator's glove might have skimmed the lip after touching a counter where dinner fibers lingered from a coat. It sounds thin until you remember scenes run hot. People move fast. Paperwork trails lag. The defense filled those gaps with doubt. They went after the bench smear next. The reusable tape additive could match other rolls on campus, not just that lab supplier. The adhesive under IR, they said, might have fluoresced because of cleaning solvent residue, not tape. They produced photos of similar artifacts from unrelated rooms, enough visual noise to confuse a listener who isn't steeped in materials analysis. On Access, they leaned into machine fallibility. Shadow Swipe became Ghost Log. Legacy controllers cache bad reads, reboots, reorder events. Council played clips of IT staff admitting drift and reconciliation quirks. If the system shuffles lines, then the sequence swipe, hold, open could be a mirage. The professor's calendar note, plan around, was cast as diligence, not deceit. Good scientists plan around downtime to protect experiments. The third phone? A decoy, they said. Rivals with axes to grind could plant a prepaid handset and ping towers to smear a colleague. The microfiber pouch with dinner fibers was chalked up to everyday transfer. The professor attends many events. Their experts spoke about secondary and tertiary transfer like it was pollen, ubiquitous, meaningless outside context. Context, they argued, was poisoned by campus politics. They widened the lens to culture. This lab ran hot because the institution rewarded heat, Council said. Skipped drills, backdated logs, shared sessions. These weren't aberrations. They were norms masked as best practice. If the student was saving originals, good. That's diligence. If records differed, that's sloppiness under pressure, not conspiracy. The defense courted juror fatigue with procedural fog, audits, versions, caches, drift. The more arcane the system sounded, the less certain a single path seemed. Expert duels followed. Prosecution's trace analyst said, grinder silicates on the mug plus toxin residue at the lip-narrowed cause. Defense's trace analyst countered with background environmental silicates from building construction. The prosecution pointed to fiber family matches to donor napkins. Defense said, hospitality textiles are common. Matches prove class, not source. Back and forth until science felt like opinion. They hammered motive. Affairs end, counsel said. People behave poorly in relationships without committing homicide. They painted the voicemail as a heated moment, not a prelude to violence. The professor's phrase, incident, became an anchor. He believed it was an accident. He responded accordingly. That glossed over the silence in the room, but gloss is a defense tool. They questioned the students' backups carefully. A second set of logs proves care, they conceded, but also control over narrative. Could a savvy student under pressure curate a drive to anchor a future complaint, trimming ambiguities? They didn't accuse, they insinuated. If both sides curated, certainty collapses. Then, chain of custody again. The mug moved from bench to bag, from bag to locker, from locker to lab, each handoff a chance to smear, to abrade, to collect. Counsel asked for times. When investigators answered, counsel highlighted every minute unaccounted for. Minutes become miles under cross. Their closing posture, reasonable doubt. If cross-contamination can explain residues, if legacy systems can shuffle access, if fibers fly, if money trails look like routine contracting, then the state hasn't met its burden. You're not asked to fix a culture, counsel told the jury. You're asked to decide whether one person committed a deliberate act beyond a reasonable doubt. In a building designed to tolerate ambiguity, doubt is abundant. Impact on investigators was blunt. A jury of peers would struggle to reconcile arcane digital forensics with human instinct. The accident narrative didn't erase the pattern, but it thinned it. They needed one clean link that collapsed the fog. Not another fiber, not another log. A bridge no defense could burn. It arrived, not from a lab bench, but from the student's own voice, recorded, precise, and pointed directly at access. The clean link arrived as a whisper saved to a drive, A voice note recorded the hour the audit email landed. Calm, methodical. I archived the originals. Tomorrow I'm meeting compliance. If I'm asked to change logs, I'll refuse. Then the detail that pierced the accident story. There's a spare key under his desk drawer. It opens the side door. Search warrant, desk drawer. Tape peeled back to reveal a slim brass key. Facilities confirmed the cut matched the side door core. Swabs lifted micro-residue that mirrored the push bar's compound. Same polymer bloom, same cleaning agent trace. Access meets knowledge. Investigators tested the key. It turned the cylinder cleanly, bypassing the camera's best angle. Chain of custody held. Video of the controlled entry synced to controller logs. No drift to hide behind. Counsel tried to blur intent. Emergency preparation, they said, but emergencies aren't taped to private furniture and kept off inventory, and emergencies don't line up with maintenance blinks. The note did more. It anchored timeline to motive, exposure tomorrow, containment tonight. The mug, the ajar door, the third phone, all coherent now. Impact is simple. The voice note locked the narrative. Access wasn't theoretical. It was taped under a drawer, waiting for a night when daylight became the threat. Motive isn't the why you tell a camera. It's the engine that drives choices when nobody is watching. Here, the engine wasn't jealousy or sudden rage. It was exposure. Exposure threatened the professor's core identity, scientist, builder of a high-performing lab, the person donors trusted when timelines shrank and results appeared. If the lab faltered, the self faltered. If the student spoke, the mask cracked. Think about this mind as a locked box. Everything inside is arranged to maintain an image, rigorous, visionary, indispensable. Anything that doesn't fit gets pushed to the corners, hidden in euphemisms. Calibration, mitigation, incident. Control is the lock. Identity is what the lock protects. When a boundary appears, we're done. Tomorrow with compliance, the lock jams. You can force the lid or you can remove the boundary. That's the motive. Speaking of motive, you map it against behavior. Start with the quiet architecture, off-book payments to a sibling's consultancy, a stipend to a research assistant whose badge remained in the system, a third phone to compartmentalize risk, a key taped under a drawer to bypass inventory and cameras. Those aren't improvised choices. They're a culture of control built over months, designed to reduce visibility and move pressure out of official channels. If you accept that this person curated access so tightly, the next step, curating a scene, doesn't stretch. Then layer in reputation economics. The professor's private emails to development promised velocity beyond formal milestones. Donors were primed for results at a pace the method didn't always support. The students' backups threatened not just a paper, they threatened the supply line of prestige. In environments where reputation can be converted into grants, seats, and stage time, reputational collapse feels existential. That's why some people won't risk it. They'll risk everything else instead. This was the moment everything changed. The voicemail. "We need to stop, or I go to compliance." The phrase is surgical. It fuses two threats: end the relationship and expose the lab's record, remove the asymmetric control, and expose the crafted image. If your identity is fused to both, the message doesn't read like conflict. It reads like annihilation. The professor's response wasn't to engage in daylight. It was to schedule around the building's blink and press the same advantage they'd used for months: work in the dark, manage the optics, keep the story clean. Control expresses itself in language long before it acts. We maintain flexibility, intensive mentorship, plan around, phrases that recast rules as preferences. In private, that elasticity turns logs into calibration, turns a spare key into emergency, turns a third phone into prudence. The student's insistence on fixed terms, originals, daylight, compliance, threatened the grammar of that world. If rules re-harden, the the professor loses the ability to rename risk into routine. The act restores the old dictionary by force. Now consider entitlement. Not the cartoon version, boasting, swagger, but the quiet conviction that outcomes should match intent because intent is pure. The professor sees themselves as the steward of an important line of work. Donors believe, students believe, administrators believe. In that frame, any roadblock becomes an error to correct, not a boundary to respect. A student's autonomy looks like a bug in the system. You fix the bug. That's entitlement made operational. Compartmentalization keeps that self-image intact. In one compartment, charismatic mentor, champion of students, late nights for science. In the other, boundary crossings, data polish, access workarounds. The compartments don't touch until a stress event punches through. The voicemail did that. Once the wall cracks, you either integrate, accept fault, face exposure, or you double down, seal the leak, silence the source, restore separation. The professor chose the second path. Everything we've seen supports it. The choreography of maintenance windows, the mug placed to read as ordinary, the exit before cameras woke. The affair wasn't incidental to this motive. It was the delivery mechanism for control. Praise isolates, access binds, gifts become obligations. When approval is rationed, the student's self-worth attaches to the source. Breaking that attachment isn't just a romantic act, it's a professional defection. The student didn't just end a relationship, they stepped outside a gate the professor controlled and reached for an institution the professor couldn't. That's the threat profile in one sentence. Map motive to actions. To preserve identity, the professor normalized late-night exceptions and trained the lab to accept blurred lines. To preserve control, they maintained off-ledger access, spare key, ghost badge, burner phone. To preempt exposure, they exploited a predictable blackout, placed a familiar object where muscle memory would complete the motion, and left a scene designed to be read as accident by anyone who hadn't seen the backups. Each step aligns with a single goal: keep the story intact. Why not another path? Because the alternative, admit, apologize, step down, requires an identity that survives outside performance. If your self is fused to output and image, removal feels like erasure. People built on that fusion will tolerate escalating risk if it promises stasis. That's why the consultancy dissolved at dawn. That's why language calcified into passives. That's why the mug moved 3 inches deeper than habit. Meanwhile, something else was happening internally. The student's shift from we to I wasn't just rhetorical. It was the lab's first sign of immune response. The professor's motive then was also defensive, to prevent a culture from recalibrating around transparency that excluded them. If compliance enters the room, the professor's status shrinks. If the student brings originals, the lab's curated past becomes visible. The act wasn't to gain something new, it was to stop something inevitable. It comes down to this: in high-prestige systems, power often hides behind excellence. The professor used excellence as a shield. When the shield cracked, they reached for the tools they knew: access, timing, language, to force the world back into shape. Not out of spectacle, out of cold calculation. The profile we built early, control of information, selective warmth, image management, now has a spine made of choices that match the moment of threat. So, are you convinced? You don't need a confession. You need coherence. Exposure threatened identity. Control was the method to prevent it. The spare key made access easy. The maintenance blink made risk low. The mug made delivery ordinary. The voice note made motive explicit. Accept that alignment, and the rest of the case falls into place, not as a sensational twist, but as the predictable end of a long pattern that finally met resistance. When a story hardens around one suspect, you pressure test the edges by pulling at the nearest antagonist. The rival professor wore that role neatly, publicly skeptical, quietly ambitious, already on record as the first to question the data. If someone wanted the star student out of the way or the lab humiliated, you could spin a theory around that rival without breaking a sweat. The trick is to separate opportunism from complicity. Start with the timeline the rival controlled. Weeks before the death, they asked for raw traces under the banner of collaboration. Their emails stayed polished. Collegial tone, method interest, the kind of language that looks safe when forwarded. But their grad assistant's overlays flagged duplicated baseline noise on a poster, and the rival pushed that anomaly toward compliance with a tip that conveniently widened scrutiny on the professor's lab. That's not murder. That's leverage. Digital forensics mapped the rival's pulls from the department server. They'd downloaded poster files and figure drafts before filing the complaint. That's a breach of etiquette. You don't mirror a colleague's work unless you anticipate a fight or a fall. The rival anticipated both. Their internal notes, obtained later, listed bullet points for a potential grant pivot if the lab's credibility dipped. Absorb equipment time, recruit displaced trainees, pitch donors on integrity. It reads like a plan to inherit the stage, not to burn it down. But the question is narrower. Did the rival touch the night? Tower logs didn't place their phone near the science building in the critical window. Elevator logs they volunteered in interview showed fourth-floor movement at a time that fits their alibi. And the assistant's text corroborated a 2:20 exit campus-wide, late, but not predatory late. The corridor Mike and Dor states tell a one-person choreography. The rival's gate doesn't enter the dance. Still, intent matters. The rival fed the rumor mill. Speaking to a friendly columnist, they floated phrases like questions about mentorship boundaries and concerns about data hygiene. Not allegations, just smoke. The piece hit the campus news feed days before compliance's audit email. Cause and effect blur here, and the rival liked it that way. Public pressure is a tool, but tools used in daylight aren't the same as hands that place mugs in a blackout. Consider motive through the rival's lens. The professor's lab overshadowed the department. Donors preferred charisma with results. The rival's work was slower, more methodical, less telegenic. A scandal would rebalance the field. If the student went to compliance, that scandal would spool out anyway. The rival's best play was acceleration. Push scrutiny faster than the professor could spin. That's opportunity. It's not complicity in a death. Investigators stress-tested that distinction by pulling the rival's device backups. Message drafts to collaborators contained language that hints at strategy. If this pops, we have to be ready to catch the fallout, offer bench space, emphasize culture. There's a line they don't cross. No discussion of access, no reference to maintenance windows, no mention of side doors. The logistics that define the murder live outside their texts. They worked the audience, not the lights. Meanwhile, they did breach ethics. Forensics found they'd downloaded raw poster files before they had formal permission, then used those files to build their complaint. That's not collaborative, it's predatory. In interrogations, their eagerness curdled into tells, alibis volunteered before questions, compliments framed as barbs. They're productive, followed by a pause that says too much. You can dislike someone's style and still stop far short of homicide. The third phone twist forced another check. Did the rival ever operate a burner? Carrier metadata turned up nothing. Their patterns were boring, which in these cases reads like exculpatory. A person who seeds decoys usually leaves playbooks. The rival left strategies for committees, not for doors. Then, the napkin fibers. A campus donor dinner is a small city. Many faculty attend. The rival was on the guest list, seated a few tables away. Could their linen shed into the same trace soup? Sure, but their office showed none of the same fiber family during a comparative swab, and their lab benches, sampled blind, didn't carry the grinder silicates. Trace points to adjacency in life, not in the room. One micro-story pins their character. The night the student's voicemail went unheard, the rival sent a late email to compliance with a subject line: Urgent data integrity questions. The body contained 3 figure pairs and a line. This may be nothing, but in light of recent concerns, I believe it warrants a look. It's calibrated to sound responsible while stoking alarm. They didn't know about the voicemail. They knew the wind was shifting and set their sail. When confronted with the consultancy payments and ghost badge, the rival's face gave away surprise. Real or rehearsed, you judge by lag. Their follow-up questions went tactical. Does this mean we freeze their shared equipment bookings? Calculating, yes, but calculation here rides the wave. It doesn't make the wave. If they'd been party to the access scheme, they wouldn't need to ask how to exploit its exposure. They'd already be positioned. Speaking of positioning, the rival did try to claim displaced trainees fast. Emails went out within days of the lab's lockdown. We can offer continuity, no questions asked. That's an ethics violation, recruitment during active investigation, but it's not evidence of the night. Investigators separated those threads, sanctioned the poaching, keep the murder case clean. In the end, the rival's transcripts read like a study in opportunism. They nudged compliance, courted, press, prepped to step into the vacuum. They also bruised boundaries by pre-downloading files to bolster their argument. But when you lay their digital footprint over the building's heartbeat, side door holds, tower pings, mug placement, the shapes don't match. Their hands never touch the choreography that killed. Impact for the case? The red herring resolved without sympathy. The rival remains a cautionary figure, someone who sharpened the knives of politics while pretending to just clean the kitchen. They didn't plant the mug. They didn't tape the key. They didn't time the maintenance blink. They benefited from the storm they helped call in, but they didn't control the lightning. With that cleared, investigators turned the camera back to the lab center, where access, motive, and method already overlapped, and then to the campus that would have to live with what came next. In the days after the warrant pulled the spare key and the voice note locked the frame, the building shifted from research hive to controlled zone. Tape replaced open doors. The lab's Slack went silent, then vanished from the university directory. Students walked past their benches like they were looking through glass at a version of themselves they couldn't reach anymore. Administrators moved fast on paper and slow in hallways. Grants froze with a single email. Pending review. Shipments were rerouted to central receiving. The liquid nitrogen dewar, once a weekly ritual, sat full. Custodial posted a notice about biohazard clearance without saying why. The lab's nameplate came down quietly at night, the screw heads bright against the paint. Reassignment meetings began. One by one, trainees sat in conference rooms with neutral chairs and a sympathetic dean. Continuity was the word. Continuity meant new supervisors, new milestones, months of work bent to fit someone else's method. Projects that lived on the professor's vision had to be translated into a language other labs spoke. Some didn't survive translation, not because the science was bad, but because ownership and nuance were locked inside a culture that no longer existed. International students faced a harder edge. Visas tied to a specific lab or funding line turned brittle when the lab shuttered and the grant froze. Advisors wrote letters. Legal pushed for extensions. A few got them, a few didn't. One student packed a desk into 2 suitcases and an extra carry-on that held only notebooks, protocols written in a hand that had learned to doubt its own value. At the airport, an officer asked, "Business or pleasure?" The student said neither. Micro-stories made the cost plain. A second year who'd never missed a weekend check-in found themselves on a campus bus instead of in a cab to a conference they'd earned. Their poster sat rolled under a bed. A senior tech, the one whose coffee always went cold while centrifuges spun, filed a resignation and took a job in industry with better hours and no keys to tape. They left a note on a whiteboard, label everything. Compliance rewrote the building before the lab's benches were fully cleared. Badge revocation latency dropped from days to minutes. Door controllers updated to stagger maintenance windows so no corridor went fully dark. Camera feeds got overlapping coverage with embedded timestamps that couldn't be altered without throwing an alarm. IT banned simultaneous reboots across floors. The maintenance calendar lost its convenient blocks. Access policy changed in ways you felt in your pocket. Shared credentials disappeared. Each instrument required individual sign-ons with two-factor prompts that expired quickly. Tailgating was no longer a write-up. It triggered a temporary lock and a visit from security within minutes. Facilities audited spare keys like controlled substances. Desk drawers were opened and cataloged. Anything found taped to wood went into an evidence bag or the trash. Culture took longer. The department scheduled mandatory power dynamics training that wasn't the old slide deck. Facilitators talked about coercion that wears the face of mentorship. They described gifts that feel like opportunity and become leverage. They ran role plays that made people practice the word no without a smile to soften it. Not everyone liked it. A few rolled eyes, then stopped when they realized the stories weren't abstractions. They were their colleagues' lives. A confidential reporting line went live with actual protection behind it. Third-party intake, guaranteed response times, status updates that didn't vanish into policy fog. Early reports didn't name new crimes. They named patterns. Favoritism masked as merit, late-night exceptions that bred more exceptions, language that minimized discomfort. The line made people talk. Talking made patterns visible. Some were addressed with coaching, some with discipline. Meanwhile, students from the disbanded lab landed where they could. A few were absorbed by the rival despite the ethics lecture that came with it. Others joined labs with different problems, less glamour, more patience. One went home for a semester and came back to a new project that didn't carry the old shadow. Another shifted fields entirely, moving from bench work to policy because it felt like the only way to change the conditions that had made their story possible. The professor's office emptied under supervision, books boxed, conference lanyards coiled and tossed, a framed photo at a donor gala slid into a crate labeled "Hold." The consultancy's mail returned to sender. In the hallway, a new faculty member toured the space with facilities, talking about airflow and outlets like those were the only things that mattered. You could forgive them for focusing on ducts. They hadn't watched a lab become a crime scene. The research community moved as it does, press statements about integrity, internal memos, about isolated incidents, and a quiet recalibration in how people talked over coffee. We've always done it this way. Started to sound less like tradition and more like a warning. The phrase, "ask forgiveness later," lost its charm. Forgiveness had a body attached to it now. In the aftermath, the most merciless change was internal. Students realized how much of their identity had been built around a lab's name and the approval of one person. Without that anchor, some drifted. Others found ground in each other. A WhatsApp group that used to trade protocol tips turned into a daily check-in, jobs posted, references offered, phrases tested. "I'm uncomfortable with this request," until they sounded like something you could say in a room with power. Policy caught up to a point. New oversight committees reviewed late-night access requests and asked simple questions. Why now? Who signs? What's the plan if something goes wrong? They added an automatic email to compliance when a lab door stayed ajar past 2 minutes. They instituted random audits on reagent logs that included unannounced spot checks. They built a report that flagged identical noise patterns in datasets across projects before they hit posters. Small tools, unglamorous, decisive. Not every fix came from the top. A cohort of grads made a pact. No one meets off campus with a supervisor about research. If someone insists, the answer is no, and the message is mirrored to a group chat. An admin assistant kept a wall calendar of maintenance windows taped above her monitor, not to help labs plan around, but to help them plan away. A tech kept spare safety goggles near the eye wash with a note. If you need to run, you can still see. If you're looking for clean closure, a lab disbanding doesn't give it. Degrees were delayed. CVs acquired asterisks nobody wanted to explain. Some careers ended with a sentence that didn't mention the work, only the context. The lab closed during investigation. That line sits heavy on applications. It forces a conversation in every interview. A few committee chairs asked better questions because of this case. A few didn't. What does a campus learn when excellence collapses? That trust isn't a banner you hang above a doorway. It's a system of checks that assumes even the celebrated can exploit gaps. The building's wiring changed. The rules did too. The people, slowly. The point isn't that policy can stop every harm. It's that policy can make harm harder to hide and easier to speak about before it becomes a crime scene. The thing is, this case didn't break because someone was brilliant. It held because procedures, some fragile, some improvised, stacked into a net. When one thread slipped, another caught. If you're building a lab or running an investigation, consider this. Process beats persona. Every time, start with chain of custody. The mug nearly became a prop the defense could dismantle. Scene heat invites shortcuts. Gloves change late, labels wait, lockers get shared. The only reason the mug's trace survived challenge was redundancy. Each transfer got a timestamp and a second set of eyes. When a minute went missing, a duplicate sample taken within the same interval at the same position closed the hole. That's not luck. That's policy that anticipates human speed under stress. Now, access control. The building's door controllers logged ajar states and shadow swipes. But their weakness was latency and reconciliation. Legacy systems cached reads and stitched them later, which opened a lane for doubt. The fix isn't exotic. It's immediate revocation and cross-checks in real time. If a badge is deactivated at noon, it should fail at 12:02. Stood at 01, not after an overnight sync. And doors shouldn't just say open or closed. They should report held duration and trigger an alert when a threshold is crossed. A lab door yawning for 9 minutes should notify a human, not a backup log. Telemetry saved what cameras missed. Camera reboots at 2 a.m. created a visual blackout a clever actor exploited. Process answers that with overlap and desynchronization. You stagger maintenance so one corridor's camera is up when another goes down. You embed time signatures at capture so post-processing can't shift an event's place in the record without setting off alarms. And you pair video with low bandwidth sensors, mics that catch clinks, door reads that log holds, motion detectors in stairwells. One system will always fail. The point is to make sure they don't fail together. Think about the third phone. Carrier metadata doesn't care about phones wiped clean or messages deleted. It cares about towers, sectors, seconds. Process means you obtain those records early, even when you think the case is simple. You map them to building events you already trust. Door holds, autosaves, calendar blocks. The alignment either strengthens your theory or breaks it before trial does. Data integrity wasn't saved by institutional systems. It was saved by the students' parallel logs. That's uncomfortable. We don't want whistleblowing to be the last line of defense, but it teaches the value of immutable audit trails. Instruments should write to append-only ledgers, ideally mirrored off device, so backdating becomes visible as a discontinuity, not a debate. When personal backups become the linchpin, you've already lost narrative control. Build official versions that make quiet edits impossible. Then, reagent accountability. A missing vial shouldn't hide behind inventory noise. Serial tracking tied to time-bounded users with small volume dispenses logged by device reduces ambiguity. Add random spot checks that compare physical counts to logs. Surprise audits that aren't punitive, just preventive. If someone knows a count might be verified at any hour, calibration stops being a catch-all. On the trace side, the temptation is to chase silver bullets. Fibers and silica weren't silver bullets. They were anchors because the baseline existed. Investigators swabbed adjacent benches, door frames, common equipment, and built a local map of what normal looked like. Without that, a single napkin fiber means nothing. With it, a lone family match at one station means misfit. Process is what lets a microtrace say more than a lab story. Speaking of baselines, environmental drift eats cases. Buildings under renovation shed silicates that confound grinder dust. HVAC cycles change deposition patterns. You counter that by sampling over time, not just space. Establish a weekly background profile for high-traffic rooms. If a spike appears on a night of interest, you know it's an event, not a seasonal shift. Communication logs matter as much as chemistry. The voice note worked because it captured concrete details: what was archived, who would be told, where a key was taped. If your institution wants truth to surface sooner, normalize contemporaneous notes that route to a secure, auditable channel. Think of it as a sealed envelope with a timestamp you can open if something goes wrong. It's not about spying, it's about protecting people who see problems first. Now, vendor sprawl. The consultancy invoices slipped because descriptions were vague and amounts were tuned to dodge review thresholds. Process answers with pattern recognition across purchasing, flag shared addresses between vendors and employees' relatives, auto-route any service provider linked to insiders for conflict checks, and split approval across finance and compliance, not just development. When money intersects with access, stipends for off-book assistance, accounts payable becomes a security layer. Training is a forensic tool, not the checkbox kind. The practical kind that teaches a tech to narrate aloud while bagging evidence, to call out when chain steps break, to stop the room when two people reach for the same object. This case benefited from a lab manager whose habits, however weary, preserved crucial context. Imagine if every bench had that reflex and every department reinforced it quarterly with drills that look like the real thing. You also plan for insider risk. Most systems assume external threats, stolen laptops, strangers at doors. Process must assume the celebrated can exploit the same gaps they champion fixing. That's not cynicism, it's humility. Role-based access should decay automatically, elevated privileges should sunset and require rejustification. Maintenance calendars shouldn't be editable by those who benefit most from the dark. Consider documentation language. Passive phrasing, incident, exposure event, flattened accountability, and tried to sand the edges off intent. Process counters with structured reporting that forces active voice, clear actors, and time-stamped steps. Door was found. Ajar becomes X held door from 2D07 to 209-11. When culture prefers fog, forms should insist on verbs. Let's pivot to coordination. Investigators stitched logs from IT, security, compliance, development, and the lab. That happened on human willpower, not by design. Build joint response protocols before you need them. A standing cross-functional team that can pull door states, tower maps, procurement trails, and instrument autosaves into one pane without subpoenas and turf fights. Speed preserves fidelity. Fidelity withstands cross-examination. Finally, scale the lesson beyond one campus. The mechanics are portable: immediate badge revocation, staggered camera reboots, overlapping sensors, append-only data trails, conflict-checked vendors, sealed, time-stamped reporting channels, insider-aware access policies, active voice incident forms, and drills that treat chain of custody as muscle memory, not myth. None of this depends on a single personality. That's the point. Process over persona doesn't mean distrusting people. It means protecting them and the truth from the moments when pressure, power, or fear tempts even good minds to bend the frame. In this case, the frame bent and then broke. The systems that caught the break were simple, specific, and repeatable. If you run a lab, build them now. If you investigate crime in spaces of excellence, demand them. Because excellence is a mask. Process is the mirror that shows what's behind it. Strip away the firmware quirks and the reagent codes, and you're left with two people making choices under pressure. The student wanted recognition that didn't come at the cost of themselves. The professor wanted control that didn't look like control. Those needs collided long before a key was taped or a mug moved. Think about the first pivot. Praise as gravity. The student gets singled out for advanced responsibility. It feels like being seen. In a field where your worth is often a line on someone else's slide, that attention lands heavy. You take the extra shift. You accept the shared key for efficiency. You call it mentorship because the alternative would mean naming leverage, and naming leverage would mean stepping outside the circle that keeps you fed. Meanwhile, the professor frames every ask as opportunity. Stay late to get ahead. Hold the door so the run doesn't fail. Adjust the language on the log so it matches the spirit of the method. Each request is tiny, defensible, wrapped in the story of excellence. Under pressure, small asks become the path of least resistance. The lab's culture normalizes the path. "We do what it takes" is a line that absolves the person who benefits most. Now, put yourself at the junction where the student's pride turns into doubt. You see duplicated noise in a figure. You hear a rival's questions. You feel the professor's warmth tighten into oversight. The first instinct is to fix it internally. Raise it softly, look for a benign explanation, keep the family intact. You send a quiet email. You wait, silence answers. The second instinct is backup. You save originals. It's not rebellion yet. It's insurance. Pressure doesn't announce itself. It distributes. A visa clock ticks for a friend. A grant deadline advances. A donor dinner glows. Meanwhile, your cohort is watching with a mix of envy and caution. If they speak, they risk exile. If they stay quiet, they become an audience to their own erasure. So they choose what people choose in high-performing groups, proximity over protest. Not because they're cruel, because the system pays attention to outputs, not ethics, until it doesn't. The professor reads the room the same way. They know prestige buys forgiveness. They also know forgiveness is fragile when compliance starts asking for raw timestamps. Under that pressure, control escalates. It always does. You shift from suggestion to instruction. You rationalize the instruction because the work is important and the student owes the project their loyalty. The story of the mentor becomes the story of the manager. The warmth remains, but it's conditional. Stay close and you'll be safe. The student's voice notes capture the internal split. Pride in the work, shame in the shortcuts. That's the cost of silence. It wears the face of self-doubt. Am I disloyal if I report? Am I naive if I don't? The line that breaks the frame, "We need to stop," or "I go to compliance," isn't an act of drama. It's an act of self-preservation spoken without volume because volume has a penalty. The choice is simple in words and messy in a career. Leave the family or fix the family. They choose daylight. Under pressure, the professor also chooses. The building's maintenance calendar isn't just a technical artifact, it's a psychological mirror. Do you plan for transparency or plan around it? The note, "Plan around," tells you the answer. It's not rage, it's logistics, the same skill set that made the lab fast. Anticipating bottlenecks, smoothing paths, minimizing friction, now serves a darker end. Method repurposed by motive. Peers feel the temperature shift and adjust their posture accordingly. A tech who once laughed at "get results, ask forgiveness later" now stops a conversation when logs are mentioned. A postdoc who benefited from the professor's recommendations starts drafting a CV targeted at labs that run slower, less glamorous. Choices radiate outward. You can see a cohort deciding in real time whether excellence is worth the cost of being complicit. Consider the small acts that could have changed the trajectory. a lab manager insisting that badges aren't shared, a dean declining to accept consultancy invoices with fog for descriptions, a grad refusing to tailgate even when a supervisor's hands are full. None of these acts have headlines. Under pressure, they look inconvenient, even petty. But petty is where prevention lives. There's another human line here: how autonomy gets traded for belonging. The professor's praise isolates. Invitations move off campus, away from colleagues who might anchor norms. The student's calendar fills with one-on-ones that start as mentorship and drift into leverage. If your sense of worth is calibrated by one person, your risk tolerance rises for them and drops for yourself. The antidote is distributed belonging. Peers, secondary mentors, channels that don't route through a single gatekeeper. Systems can mandate that. People have to use it. Which brings us to bystanders. Several saw patterns: the late-night runs, the skipped drills, the log calibrations. They chose silence not because they lacked ethics, but because the lab's outputs built their own futures. Under pressure, complicity looks like prudence. The fix isn't to condemn after the fact. It's to lower the cost of early speech. Confidential reporting with teeth, peer networks that share risk, administrators who act within days, not months. The student's final choice: save originals, set a meeting, refuse edits, was courage shaped by preparation. Courage without preparation becomes martyrdom. They archived, they documented, they set daylight. Under pressure, that's the blueprint. Secure facts, name boundaries, route into a process that can absorb blowback, and then expect blowback anyway. If you're a mentor, consider what your students learn when you bend just this once. They learn where the floor is. Under pressure, they'll stand on the floor you set. If you're a trainee, consider what you accept when a gift comes with a key. Ask what happens to the key when the gift sours. Under pressure, you won't invent new ethics. You'll lean on the ones you practiced when nothing was at stake. The human element is not a soft coda to the forensics. It's the constant. The professor's need for control turned systems into instruments. The student's need for recognition made those instruments feel like opportunity until they didn't. The lab's quiet compromises taught everyone which rules could be rewritten by tone and deadlines. And when a single person decided to stop playing along, the pressure that had been distributed collapsed into a single night. Impact, if you want it clean, is this: environments that reward outputs over process will always push people to choose speed over safety, loyalty over truth. You can't retrain a building, you retrain habits. You set tripwires that make small deviations visible. You normalize a sentence that should be safe to say at any bench: no, we'll do this in daylight. When those patterns take root, fewer stories end with tape across a lab door and a campus learning the hard way what pressure does to choice. Formal charges landed with the precision of a lab protocol: homicide and fraud. The indictment braided two strands investigators had kept separate for months: death in a controlled space and the paper trail that fueled the lab's image. The booking photo didn't show rage, it showed fatigue. Counsel handled the rest. Prosecutors led with access. The spare key taped under the drawer. The controller logs that placed a door on ajar during the camera reboot. The third phone's tower pings tracing a narrow orbit around the service corridor. Then they layered motive: exposure tomorrow, control tonight, and method. A mug positioned deeper than muscle memory, residue riding coffee oils, an eye wash triggered after inhalation. It wasn't theatrical, it was linear. Discovery stretched, motions targeted the voice note. Defense argued hearsay and relevance, then narrowed to authentication. The metadata held. The student's device ID matched, the timestamp aligned with the audit email, and the content connected to a physical object, the key under the desk, recovered under warrant. The court let it in. The consultancy records moved next, payments diverted to a sibling's entity. stipends to a research assistant who never appeared on payroll, the deactivated badge that still ghosted a swipe at 1:58 a.m. Defense called it sloppy accounting and delayed revocation. Prosecutors called it a designed lane, money as access, access as leverage. Then, depositions. Development staff testified to private promises, milestones pulled forward in emails that never reached the grants office. IT staff mapped reboot schedules and acknowledged the risk nobody had flagged until after the death. Security admitted tailgating write-ups without teeth. Each witness described a piece of a system that assumed good faith. The cumulative picture was a building that could be read like a manual by someone patient enough. Jury selection revealed the hurdle. Scientists and administrators wanted to litigate culture. Prosecutors needed to try a night. Counsel calculated the risk and pivoted before voir dire finished. A plea opened. Manslaughter, reckless homicide with systemic negligence as context, paired with fraud counts reduced to a restitution framework. No admission of premeditated intent. A research ban for life. A sealed agreement about cooperation on policy reforms that would never make a headline. In court, the allocution was careful. The professor accepted responsibility for a lab accident under my supervision. They acknowledged failures in oversight and poor boundaries, phrases tested by attorneys until they carried weight without tipping into confession. They didn't say affair, they didn't say key, they didn't say mug, they said culture. The sentence read like an equation. Years in custody scaled down by the plea, followed by supervised release. A permanent prohibition on supervising research or holding access credentials in any academic or corporate lab. Restitution to a fund in the student's name that paid forward what their work might have funded. Scholarships earmarked for first-generation scientists, protected from the kind of dependence that had cost so much here. The family spoke. Not about science, about a life built on long nights and group chats and a future with notes still taped to a desk. They asked for a clearer word than accident. The court gave them procedure. The community gave them a hallway full of colleagues who knew what the softer words avoided. Back on campus, the plea collapsed debates that had become ritual. Not because it answered the moral question, but because it ended the legal one. People who wanted a jury's verdict felt robbed. People who feared a jury's confusion felt relief. Administrator statements circled a new phrase, zero tolerance for boundary violations, and tied it to the ban, a line in policy backed by a line on a docket. The professor's last public statement was a single sentence read by counsel. I accept the court's judgment and will not contest the sanctions placed upon me. No apology for the affair. No acknowledgement of coercion. The word incident returned one last time, filed under a tone that still tried to sand intent into error. The room heard the gap. So did the students who had learned to listen for passives. Restitution checks began to land in a small account within months. Grants, frozen at first contact, dissolved and were reissued in competitions that didn't favor charisma. A committee posted a list of reforms with boring names and sharp edges. Append-only logs, staggered reboots, conflict screens in purchasing, two-factor on every instrument. The professor's name fell off conference programs and out of acknowledgments. The lab's papers were re-reviewed. Some survived, corrected, a few retracted. Citations shifted to a story about rigor, not speed. Closure for investigators wasn't the point. They wanted a clean link and a prevention plan. They got the voice note, the key, and a plea that kept the next case from arguing a precedent that would fail, lay jurors squinting at die peaks and door states. They also got calls from other campuses asking for the playbook. Process travels faster than scandal when people are ready. The last file closed with a signature and a notation. Research ban entered, restitution scheduled, compliance training implemented. It looked administrative. It was. That's where most justice lives when crimes hide in ordinary rooms. A lab door reopened months later under a different PI. The tape residue on the bench underside had been scrubbed clean. New students learned a protocol that included a line the old one never had. If you need to stop, you can stop. If you see a line bending, you can call. The plea left moral ambiguity where some wanted certainty. It also left a set of constraints that made repetition harder. The campus didn't celebrate. It changed the calendar, the locks, and the language. In a world that rewards and outputs, that's as close to resolution as institutions get. Power wrapped in excellence will always test the gaps. Without process, the harm walks in through the side door. If you want more deep dives into the criminal mind, subscribe now. Let me know in the comments, what psychological flaw led to this killer's downfall? Watch the next episode to see how one overlooked audit line exposed another predator hiding in plain sight.